Welcome, dear listener, to a story stitched from magic and memory. A tale that drifts in the soft hours between waking and sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on the day and the heart becomes more willing to believe in wonder. Tonight, we return to a world you know by feel as much as by name, a world of wands and whispered spells, of ancient stone corridors warmed by candlelight, of friendships forged under pressure and made unbreakable by time. Settle into comfort now, wherever you are. Let your shoulders drop. Let the noise of the day slide away from you like mist lifting off the surface of the black lake. Breathe in slowly, and with each breath, let yourself move closer to that quiet place where stories live, the place where magic feels almost possible. Our tale is about courage and consequence, about what comes after the final battle, about three souls who survived a war and then discovered, as so many do, that peace is not a simple reward. Peace has its own demands. Peace can be heavy. Peace can ask questions that war never had time to ask. This is the story of Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger. Not as students, not as soldiers, but as something new, still forming. This is the story of their becoming. The war had ended. You remember it, dear listener. The great hall in ruins, the air sharp with smoke and spellwork, and Lord Voldemort finally falling. There was no triumphant music to mark the moment, only a strange, stunned quiet. And then, slowly, like a chest finally releasing a breath it didn't know it was holding, the wizarding world began to exhale. Yet endings, as any witch or wizard with sense will tell you, are only beginnings wearing different robes. In the months that followed that terrible, beautiful dawn, everything began again, carefully, painfully, piece by piece. Hogwarts reopened, though the castle felt older, as if the stones themselves had learned too much. The Ministry of Magic rebuilt with cautious hands, trying to patch what betrayal had torn apart. The daily rhythms returned, shop bells chiming, owl wings beating, kettles whistling, and beneath it all, a question hovered in the air like an unspoken charm. What now? So settle in, dear listener. Let the outside world dim at the edges. Tonight, we watch as three friends step forward into a future uncertain and untested, carrying yesterday's scars in their pockets and tomorrow's hope in their hands. Close your eyes if you like. Follow the gentle pace of the tale. And as you drift towards sleep, remember this: courage comes in many forms, and even heroes must learn, sooner or later, how to be human again. The summer after the war was unlike any other summer in living memory. It was a season of contradictions, celebration braided tightly with grief, joy threaded through sorrow like gold, stitched into dark fabric. In Diagon Alley, shop fronts brightened with fresh paint and stubborn optimism. Doors that had been boarded up opened again. Windows gleamed. Enchantments were renewed. People stepped into the street as if afraid the ground might vanish beneath them, and then, finding it solid, they began to live. Weasley's wizard wheezes blazed with color and laughter. And yet, George Weasley's smile never quite reached the place it used to. The leaky cauldron filled each evening with toasts raised high and voices saying, again and again, "We're here. We're alive. We made it." But beneath the clink of glasses ran a deeper current. Dark, steady, undeniable. Memorial services gathered in every community. Names were carved into pale stone that shone too brightly in the sun. Families moved through streets like ghosts, present but not whole. The war was over, yes, and its echo remained, reverberating through countless lives, settling into the corners of every home like dust that would not sweep away. Harry Potter stood at the tall window of number 12, Grimmauld Place, watching rain slide down the glass in long, wavering lines. The pattern reminded him, unpleasantly, of tears. The house, once Sirius Black's, once a mausoleum of old cruelty, had become something else in the aftermath. Quiet, for one thing. Private. The press couldn't reach him easily here, though they tried with relentless determination. Owls arrived daily with invitations, demands, pleading requests for statements about the future. Interviewers waited at likely corners of London, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of him the way they might catch a rare bird. He was 18, and some days he felt ancient. He turned away from the window and looked around the drawing room. Creature had worked with fierce devotion to reshape the place. The walls were no longer the old sickly green, but a warm cream that made the rooms feel less like a cave. Heavy curtains in deep burgundy softened the grey daylight. The portrait of Walburga Black had been removed entirely, an ordeal that had required specialist help and a small fortune. But the silence it left behind was worth every sickle. And still, in certain quiet moments, Harry could almost hear Sirius's laugh in the halls. Could almost picture him stretched across an armchair, boots up, eyes bright with mischief, telling stories like he had all the time in the world. The memory hurt. But Harry had learned to carry pain the way you carry a stone in your pocket. Always there, always noticeable, but somehow manageable if you grew used to its weight. A soft creak sounded at the doorway. "Tea, Master Harry," said Creature, his voice rough as old parchment. A tray hovered obediently beside him, bearing a pot and cups. "Thanks, Creature," Harry said, and managed a small smile. "Are Ron and Hermione here yet?" "Miss Granger arrived 10 minutes ago, Master Harry," Creature replied, with a tone that suggested he found Hermione's habits both baffling and oddly respectable. "She is in the library." Naturally. Harry's smile twitched into something more real. "And Ron? Master Ron sent word by Owl that he will be late," Creature said, sounding mildly scandalized. "Something about his mother and a jumper." Harry let out a quiet breath that might have been laughter. Some things, at least, stayed constant. He found Hermione exactly where Creature had said she would be, curled into one of the deep wingback chairs, a book open on her lap. But she wasn't reading. Her gaze was fixed on the rain-streaked window, her expression distant in the particular way Harry had come to recognize over 7 years of friendship. Thinking, planning, solving things that hadn't yet arrived. "You're going to wear a hole in the universe if you keep staring at it like that," Harry said softly. Hermione jolted, then laughed, closing the book with gentle finality. "Sorry, I didn't hear you come in. What's going on in that head of yours?" She hesitated, fingers resting on the book's spine, as if anchoring herself. "Tomorrow?" she said. The word settled between them, heavier than it should have been. Tomorrow. Tomorrow they would begin Auror training. It had been Harry's idea at first, though calling it an idea made it sound more deliberate than it had been. In truth, it had been more like grabbing a rope in the dark. After the war, time had stretched strangely, full of empty hours that felt dangerous in their own way. Kingsley Shacklebolt, newly appointed Minister for Magic, had offered Harry a place in the Auror office personally, waiving requirements that would have kept any normal recruit out. Harry had accepted almost before the offer had finished leaving Kingsley's mouth. Ron had joined immediately. Where Harry went, Ron followed, as naturally as breathing. It had been that way since they were 11, since a train compartment and a shared laugh, and a friendship that had held through trolls, dragons, graveyards, and war. Hermione had taken longer. She'd returned briefly to Hogwarts to help with reconstruction, organizing what could be organized, cataloguing damage with a heartbreak she tried not to show. She spoke for a time of finishing her 7th year properly, of taking her newts, of pursuing something in policy, law, or creature protection. And then, one evening, she came to Harry and Ron with her decision already made, her jaw set with quiet certainty. "You'll need someone to keep you both alive," she'd said simply. "And if we're going to change the system, We have to be inside it. That was Hermione, dear listener. Always looking beyond the immediate, always seeing the larger picture, even when the rest of them could barely see the next hour. Now, in the quiet library at Grimold Place, with rain tapping steadily at the window and the afternoon light fading into dusk, Hermione met Harry's eyes. There was excitement there, yes, but also something else. Uncertainty. Fear, perhaps, carefully managed, but real. Are you nervous? She asked. Harry sank into the chair opposite her and let the truth out without dressing it up. Terrified. Hermione's brows lifted. Harry, you fought Voldemort. I know. He huffed a laugh that didn't quite carry humor. I've been hunted. I've watched people die. He stopped, because some things still lodged in his throat like splinters. But walking into the ministry tomorrow as a trainee, taking orders, filling out paperwork, trying to act normal. It feels impossible. It isn't mad, Hermione said gently, leaning forward. Her hair fell loose around her face in the way it had when they were children, when she'd been all sharp angles and fierce determination. We've been in survival mode for years, crisis after crisis. We didn't plan futures because we weren't sure we'd get one. And now we do. And it's too much, Harry said. Overwhelming, Hermione agreed, relief flickering across her face that he had found the exact word. But we'll figure it out. We always do. The fire in the grate crackled, sending warm light over the spines of books and the soft curve of Hermione's profile. Outside, thunder rolled faintly, like a distant giant shifting in its sleep. Harry closed his eyes for a moment and listened. Rain, fire, Hermione's steady breathing. Safe sounds. The Floo roared green without warning, and Ron Weasley tumbled into the room in a mess of limbs and soot, clutching what appeared to be the loudest jumper ever knitted by human hands. Ambushed, he announced, coughing out a bit of fireplace ash. Mum cornered me. Said I can't possibly start a job without a proper good luck jumper. In summer, Hermione's shoulders shook. It's lovely, Ron. It's horrifying, Ron said brightly, flinging it onto a chair. But I'll wear it anyway, because she'll know if I don't. His expression softened, laughter fading a fraction. She's worried. About all of us. Keep saying we've done enough, that we don't have to keep doing dangerous things. They all understood what she really meant. That she had already lost one son. That she had watched the others walk toward death too many times. Harry's voice lowered. We'll be careful. Even as he said it, he felt how fragile the promise was. Not because he didn't mean it, because life had taught him how little control anyone truly had. This isn't war, Ron said, trying to convince himself as much as them. It's law enforcement. There's procedure, backup, rules, and forms, Hermione said, sliding her book aside and reaching into her bag. Of course, she had notes. Kingsley's revised training program starts with 3 weeks of orientation and assessment. They'll evaluate our skills and decide what we need. Translation, Ron said, grinning. They'll work out all the ways we broke rules and survived anyway. We didn't just survive, Harry said, more firmly than he intended. We learned. Sure, Ron said. We also broke approximately 700 school rules and a few ministry laws. Context matters, Hermione said sharply. Ron held up his hands. It does. I'm just saying, tomorrow we're supposed to learn how to be proper, follow chain of command, respect protocol, and we've spent years doing the opposite. How do you just switch that off? The question landed like a quiet spell, filling the room with stillness. Harry stared into the fire. Ron was right. It wasn't just about new jobs or new robes. It was about identity. About the habits carved into them by years of danger. About the ways they had learned, again and again, that authority could fail, that rules could be wrong, that waiting for permission could get people killed. We don't switch it off, Harry said finally. We learn to use it differently. Hermione's gaze sharpened. Explain. We learn to think for ourselves, Harry said slowly, putting words to something he'd only half understood. To question orders. To do what was right even when it was hard, or dangerous, or unpopular. Those aren't bad qualities for Aurors. We just need to channel them without turning every day into a battle. Channel our rule-breaking into procedure, Ron mused. That sounds like trying to teach a Niffler to do accounting. Hermione made a small sound that might have been amusement. We'll manage. They talked through the evening, while rain softened and the sky darkened. They spoke of training and fear, and the strange emptiness that came when the thing you were built around, survival, no longer had an immediate enemy to fight. They spoke, too, of those who weren't there. Fred, Remus, Tonks, Colin Creevey. So many names that felt like loose threads in the world. Grief, Harry had learned, wasn't a problem you solved. It was a weight you learned to carry without letting it crush you. Dinner arrived in the form of shepherd's pie that Ron had smuggled from the burrow because Mrs. Weasley loved by feeding people and could not help herself even now. They ate around the kitchen table, no longer a cold dungeon of old cruelty, but warmed by light, by herbs growing in enchanted pots, by the faint sense that a home could be made even in a place with painful history. Later, Hermione returned to the library to review her notes again. Ron and Harry stepped out into the small back garden. The rain had finally stopped. Stars appeared in clean breaks between clouds. Weird, isn't it? Ron said, hands shoved deep in his pockets. This time last year we were living in a tent, hunting horcruxes, thinking we'd die before winter. And now we've got a job. Sort of, Harry said. Nothing about us has ever been normal, Ron replied and managed a crooked grin. Why start now? Harry laughed, and it felt good. Simple, honest, unforced. They stood together in quiet, and Harry let the night air fill his lungs. Above them, stars turned in indifferent patterns. The world kept moving. Whatever tomorrow brought, the world would still turn. Whatever happens, Ron said after a moment, voice low, we do it together. Harry looked toward the library window, where Hermione's silhouette moved among shelves and lamplight. He looked at Ron, solid beside him, familiar as his own heartbeat. Like always, Harry said. Later, the house dimmed. Hermione accepted a guest room. Ron left for the burrow with a promise to meet them at the ministry entrance at 8 sharp, jumper and all. Harry climbed the stairs and lay in bed, while moonlight made pale shapes on the floor. Tomorrow he would wear robes that marked him as a trainee. Tomorrow he would walk into the ministry, not as a symbol, not as a prophecy's answer, but as a student again, expected to learn, expected to listen, expected to fit himself into a system he had spent years defying. It should have felt like stepping backward. Instead, strangely, it felt like stepping into a choice, like picking a path rather than being shoved down one. Harry closed his eyes. Outside, London hummed with its night song. Muggle and magical lives braided together in ancient streets. And somewhere, deeper in the city, beyond the lights and the familiar places, shadows waited in the crooked lanes of Nocturne Alley. Tomorrow, 3 survivors would take their first steps toward becoming protectors, and the next story would begin. The Ministry of Magic, at 8 o'clock in the morning, dear listener, is a place that pretends to be orderly while pulsing with barely contained chaos. It is a great machine made of stone, spellwork, and paperwork, and at that hour it wakes like a living creature, stretching, shifting, swallowing witches and wizards whole and sending them back out again as stamped documents and hurried decisions. Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger stood just inside the visitor's entrance, shoulder to shoulder, and tried not to look like three young people who had once run across a battlefield and now felt intimidated by a foyer. Above them, the vast atrium rose like a wizard's cathedral. A peacock blue ceiling shimmered with gold inlaid symbols that moved with slow purpose, as if the building itself was thinking. The polished floor reflected everything: robes in motion, glints of jewelry, flashes of parchment, until it was hard to tell where the world ended and its echo began. Owls swooped overhead in brisk lines. Enchanted memos folded into paper aeroplanes darted from balcony to balcony, occasionally veering down with rude enthusiasm to smack an unsuspecting clerk in the back of the head. The fountain at the center of the atrium burbled in a steady rhythm, its stone figures glistening with charms that made them look perpetually washed clean. Fireplaces along the far wall flared green and coughed out arrivals. A witch shaking soot from her sleeves, a wizard muttering at his watch, a pair of ministry workers arguing in low voices as they hurried away. Every face seemed to carry the same expression: determination mixed with the faint panic of people who believed they were already late. Right, Ron murmured, as if he were about to step into an exam rather than a government building. So this is it. Hermione's mouth tightened in that way it did when she was forcing herself to stay calm. Her hair was more controlled than usual, gathered back with a charm that kept it from rising in rebellion. She looked older in ministry robes, older than 18, or, perhaps, dear listener, it was simply that war had taken childhood away from all of them, whether they wished it or not. Harry adjusted the collar of his robe and felt the familiar weight of attention. Even here, even underground, people glanced at him as they passed, some openly, some pretending not to. There were those who looked as if they wanted to speak, to thank him, to ask him what it felt like to do what he had done. Others looked away too quickly, as if his presence reminded them of things they would rather forget. He told himself firmly that today he was just another trainee. They made their way toward a brisk-looking witch waiting near the side of the atrium, her posture straight as a wand and her expression unimpressed by everything around her. She was not tall, but she had the kind of stillness that made people step aside without knowing why. Her hair was close-cropped and gray, and her eyes, a sharp amber, flicked across the group with the precision of a hawk counting movement in a field. "Listen up," she said, voice clean and clipped. "You're here because Minister Shacklebolt has chosen to rebuild this department with stronger standards and fewer assumptions. Some of you are fresh from school. Some of you have experience." Her gaze paused on Harry, then slid over Ron and Hermione. "I am Gawain Robards," she continued, "head of the Auror office. For the next 3 years, if you survive the training, you will answer to me, to your supervising Aurors, and to the laws of magical Britain. Is that understood?" A murmur of assent rose from the trainees. "Yes, sir," some said, out of habit. "Yes, ma'am," others corrected quickly. Robards didn't seem to care which as long as they obeyed. "Good," she said, and turned without ceremony. "Follow." They moved as a group, 12 trainees in all, passing beneath the balconies and into a set of lifts that swallowed them with a dull clank of metal. As they descended through levels of the ministry, the air felt different. The atrium, for all its busyness, had a public shine. Deeper down, the corridors became narrower, quieter, more watchful. The stone walls held old enchantments that hummed faintly under the skin, protective spells layered over centuries like paint. At level 2, magical law enforcement, the atmosphere changed again. The corridor here smelled of parchment, bitter coffee, and something else. Alertness, perhaps. Duty. The low, constant tension of people who expected trouble. Training dummies lined one wall, frozen mid-defense with arms raised, faces blank. Notice boards were crowded with moving posters. Criminals still at large, suspects wanted for questioning, old photographs that blinked and scowled. Some faces looked wild with defiance. Others looked ordinary, which was somehow worse. "This way," Roberts said, and pushed open a heavy door, charmed to resist casual entry. The Auror office was not the dramatic, polished thing Harry might once have imagined when he was 11 and reading stories about famous law enforcers. It was practical, busy, slightly cluttered. Rows of desks and cubicles filled the space, each one stacked with files, maps, ink bottles, and assorted evidence bags sealed with spells. Entire walls were covered in maps, Britain marked with pins and notes. Strings of red and black thread connected names and locations in patterns that resembled spiderwebs. A massive board tracked ongoing cases, each one a living tangle of dates and suspects. The air carried the faint bite of warding enchantments, as if invisible shields were constantly being reinforced. Harry felt something settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the understanding that this place ran on reality, not on myth. This was where people came when something went wrong. Roberts turned to face them. "You'll receive your trainee assignments and your schedules. For now, understand this. You are not here to play hero. You are not here because of your name, your family, or your past." Her eyes cut again toward Harry, then moved on. "You are here to learn how to investigate, how to secure a scene, how to keep yourself alive, how to keep other people alive. Those who cannot follow instruction will not last." Ron shifted beside Harry, as if resisting the urge to make a comment. Hermione's eyes were bright with concentration. Robards handed out parchments. Hermione scanned hers immediately, lips moving as she read. Ron glanced at his and looked faintly disappointed, as if hoping it would say something like, "First day, exciting chase scene." Harry's parchment was neat and blunt. Orientation, assessment, procedures, legal frameworks, practical defense. The first days passed like a long grey river, steady and unavoidable. Each morning, they arrived in the Auror office with their bags and their wands, and their intention to do well. And each evening they left with aching minds, and the strange fatigue that came not from fighting for your life, but from trying to force your life into new shapes. They learned to treat a magical crime scene with the same care they'd once given to a Horcrux hunt. Secure the area. Identify lingering spell signatures. Catalog evidence without contaminating it. Record everything, in official language. Hermione loved the clarity of the system, even while she could see its flaws. She took notes in neat lines, asked questions that made senior Aurors pause, and argued with instructors about loopholes in wizarding precedent, until even Ron had to admit she was frightening when she got going. Ron struggled through the legal lectures with heroic effort. He sat up straight and tried to focus. But the moment someone began explaining procedural nuance in a tone that suggested even the speaker was bored, Ron's eyes would glaze. "What did they just say?" he muttered once, when a senior Auror launched into a speech about evidence chain of custody. Hermione didn't even look up. "They said, if you fail to log an item properly, the defense can argue it was tampered with, and the whole case collapses." "That's ridiculous," Ron whispered. "That's law," Hermione whispered back, which was not the same thing at all. Harry found himself caught in an uncomfortable in-between. Some Aurors treated him with strange caution, as if any criticism might offend him. Others, perhaps determined to prove they weren't impressed, were harsh to the point of cruelty. He preferred the harshness. At least it was honest. "Again," barked a senior Auror during dueling practice, after Harry's shield charm held but wavered under pressure. "You're relying on instinct. Instinct will fail when you're tired." Harry gritted his teeth, reset, and did it again, and again, and again, until his arm shook and his breath came harsh. In quieter moments, when the instructors weren't watching, he realized something that surprised him. He missed the clarity of war, not the violence, not the loss, but the simple, brutal certainty of who the enemy was and what had to be done. Here, the enemy was paperwork, procedure, the slow grind of building cases that could withstand scrutiny. It was, in its own way, a different kind of endurance. Ron found his footing not in the lectures, but in the practical work. When they were given simulated case files to analyze, Ron's mind lit up. He scanned patterns in suspect behavior, predicted next moves, and spotted contradictions that others missed. It's like chess, he said one afternoon, tapping a parchment where a witness statement didn't quite align with the timeline. If they did this here, then they had to have been there earlier, unless they used a port key. But that leaves traces. So either the witness is wrong, or they're lying. Hermione looked at him with a kind of startled respect. That's actually very good. Ron beamed. I have my moments. Weeks turned into months. Their days filled with routines and tests, written exams on legal history, practical demonstrations of defensive magic, long afternoons learning to trace cursed object signatures through old enchantments. And, for all that, dear listener, the work that mattered, the real work, remained just out of reach. They watched briefings, they read about raids. They listened to senior Aurors discuss operations in Nocturne Alley, in Nocturne-adjacent slums, in isolated villages where dark magic still pooled like old water. They were trainees. They observed. They prepared. They waited. The waiting began to feel like its own kind of torture, not because they wanted danger, but because they had spent years living in the sharpness of urgency. Without urgency, their minds began to circle. And then, one morning in October, grey and cold and ordinary, Roberts called them into her office. Not the whole trainee group, just the three of them. Harry felt the shift immediately. Ron did too. He straightened, face becoming serious. Hermione's eyes narrowed slightly, already calculating what this might mean. Robards' office was sparse, functional. Commendations lined one wall. Photographs on the other, fallen auras, their faces moving faintly, expressionless reminders of the cost of the job. A single window looked out over Muggle London, the city moving on above their hidden world without the faintest clue. Sit, Robards ordered. They sat. Robards studied them for a long moment, not as their commander, exactly, but as an evaluator, as someone measuring whether a thing could hold weight before placing it under strain. Then she slid a thin folder across the desk. Death Eater sympathizers, she said, voice flat. Operating out of Nocturne Alley. Small operation, likely. Illicit artifacts. Sanctuary for individuals avoiding trial. We have rumors, but not enough evidence. Hermione leaned forward, fingertips hovering over the folder, as if she could sense what was inside. What do you need from us? Information, Robards said. We need names, locations, connections. But every Auror in this department is known. If we send official faces, we spook them. They vanish. Her gaze sharpened. We need new faces. The room grew very still. Harry felt the meaning settle into his bones. You want us to go undercover, he said. Robards' expression didn't change. I want you to investigate, she corrected. Carefully, quietly. You will pose as buyers, young people with money and flexible morals. You will ask questions, make contact, report back. Nothing heroic, nothing stupid. You are not to attempt arrests. Ron swallowed. Hermione's spine went rigid. Can you handle that? Robards asked. Ron and Hermione looked at Harry, as they always did, without even realizing it. Not because they needed permission, because habits built in war did not vanish simply because the war had ended. Harry looked down at the folder and then back up. He felt the old cloak of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Familiar, heavy, oddly comforting. "Yes," he said. "When do we start?" Roberts slid the folder closer. "Today. After hours. You'll receive cover details. You'll receive your limits. And you'll remember this." Her voice sharpened, like a blade pressed to stone. "Nocturne Alley doesn't care who you are." Harry's scar did not hurt, but he felt, suddenly, the prickle of instinct at the back of his neck, the kind that meant darkness was near. By late afternoon, the sky over London had settled into that uneasy color between silver and slate, the kind that promised rain without committing to it. The air felt damp and watchful, and even Diagon Alley, bright, busy, stubbornly cheerful, seemed to move with a little less ease, as if something darker waited just beyond the corner of the street. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had dressed with care. Not their trainee robes, not anything that smelled of ministry order. Harry wore a dark jacket with enough pockets to hide useful things, without looking suspicious. A wand, a small vial of emergency potion, a folded scrap of parchment, with their signals written in code. Hermione's robes were a deep green that made her look older and sharper, and she had charmed her hair into a sleek restraint that felt almost unnatural on her. Ron had surrendered, with visible reluctance, his beloved Chudley Cannon's colors in favor of plain black and gray, clothes meant to disappear into shadow rather than declare allegiance. They walked side by side down the familiar stretch of Diagon Alley, the noise and warmth of it like a last deep breath before diving underwater. "We keep it simple," Hermione murmured, voice barely moving her lips. "We browse. We ask the sort of questions people ask when they're curious but not desperate. We don't push too hard. And if we get nervous," Ron added under his breath, "we pretend we're bored." Harry glanced at him. "Can you manage bored?" Ron's mouth twitched. "I'm offended. I was born bored." Hermione's eyes flicked between them. "If anyone asks, we're looking for protection," Harry finished quietly. "The sort you buy when you don't trust the ministry." Hermione nodded once. "Good." They reached the narrow opening that led into Nocturne Alley, and the change was immediate, like stepping from warmth into a cold room. The cobblestones here were slick with something that might have been water, but Harry didn't want to think too hard about what else it could be. The buildings leaned inward, their upper floors crowding the strip of sky until it became a thin, bruised ribbon. Shops hunched along both sides, windows grimy, signs written in scripts that shifted when you looked at them directly. The air smelled wrong. Damp stone, old smoke, and the bitter sting of spells that had no place in daylight. It was quieter than Harry remembered, but it wasn't empty. Figures moved in doorways half hidden beneath hoods. Shadows slid between shops, with the smooth confidence of people who did not want to be seen. No one made eye contact. No one lingered in the open. It was a street built on transactions, quick, silent, and never entirely clean. Harry pulled his hood up a fraction more out of instinct than strategy. There had been a brief conversation about Polyjuice potion. Robards had shut it down immediately. Too risky, too much that could go wrong. Besides, Robards had added with dry realism, half the criminals in Nocturne had likely mourned Voldemort. Harry Potter browsing for dark protection wouldn't strike them as impossible. The thought made Harry's stomach twist. They started at the edge of the alley, where the shop sold things that sat in a grey line between illegal and merely unpleasant. Dried ingredients, sealed in jars, some perfectly ordinary, some that made Hermione's nose wrinkle with professional disgust. Books of hexes and jinxes that claimed to be defensive, though the titles suggested they were mostly designed for making someone else's life miserable. Trinkets promising protection through methods the ministry frowned on, but didn't quite have the legal teeth to forbid. They moved slowly, pausing at displays, letting themselves be seen. Harry felt eyes on them from every angle. He understood something then that training hadn't quite captured. Here, being unnoticed was a skill, and they didn't have it yet. Their youth showed. Their careful clothes showed. Their very effort to look casual made them look like people pretending. No one was fooled. The question wasn't whether Nocturne Alley could see they were new. The question was what it would decide to do about it. The first shop they entered was narrow and dim, with shelves crowded so tightly together that the air felt pressed into thin lines. The proprietor, a witch with heavy-lidded eyes and long fingers stained with ink, watched them without blinking. "Looking for something specific?" she asked in a voice that sounded bored and sharp at once. "Just browsing," Hermione said smoothly, and Harry felt a flicker of pride. She sounded like someone who belonged in dark shops, not like someone who had once nervously asked Madame Pince for library access. The witch's gaze slid over them and lingered on Harry's face for the briefest moment. Recognition, perhaps, or simply calculation. "Mind yourselves," she said, not quite a warning, not quite advice. "This alley bites when it's hungry." They left without buying anything, their steps measured. In the second shop, Ron almost picked up a small metal sphere that pulsed faintly, but Hermione caught his wrist and shook her head once, firmly. The shopkeeper watched them with quiet amusement. In the third, a man offered them a set of rings said to guard the wearer's mind, and Harry suspected the only mind they guarded was the seller's bank account. They asked questions. They listened. They kept their voices light. They didn't flinch when someone spoke with bitterness about the ministry or with fondness about the old days. And still, nothing. It wasn't until the fourth shop, an apothecary that smelled of sulfur and desperation, that the day finally shifted. The place was called Mold Pepper's Apothecary, its sign swinging slightly in a draught that didn't seem to come from anywhere. Inside, jars of things Harry didn't want to identify lined the shelves. Dried claws, shredded leaves, powders the color of bruises, bottles of liquid that moved as if alive. A hunched wizard stood behind the counter, his hands mottled with age, his eyes like dirty ice. He watched them for a long time, not casually, the way someone watches when they're deciding whether you're prey, nuisance, or opportunity. Finally, he spoke. "If you've come for love potions, you're in the wrong place." "We're not," Harry said, letting the words land with a calm he didn't entirely feel. "We're looking for protection." The wizard's eyes narrowed. "Protection? The kind you get," Harry continued, choosing his phrases with care, "when you can't rely on the ministry." A faint curl touched the wizard's mouth. "The ministry," he said, as if the word tasted bitter. "Useless. Always has been. Worse now." Hermione's posture tightened by a hair's breadth. The wizard leaned forward slightly, and his voice lowered. "Shacklebolt and his lot pretending they're saving the world. They won't keep you safe when it matters." There it was, dear listener. The first hook, the first test. Ron's face went carefully blank. Hermione's eyes stayed steady. Harry forced his hands not to clench. "Right," Ron said, like someone who agreed with all of it. "So, are there options for people who don't fancy waiting to be protected?" The wizard studied Ron, then Hermione, then Harry again. "You've got money," he said slowly. "Enough," Harry replied. "And you've got the look," the wizard murmured, gaze sharpening with interest. "The look of young fools who think they're clever." Hermione's smile was thin and controlled. "We like to think we're careful." "Careful," the wizard repeated, as if amused by the idea. "If you were careful, you wouldn't be here." Harry felt the alley's weight pressing closer, as if it had leaned in to listen. "We heard," Harry said, leaning into the lie, "that there are people who deal in real protection, not the rubbish you find in front shops." The wizard's eyes glittered. "There are. Can you introduce us?" Hermione asked softly, with a tone that made it sound like a favor she would repay. Silence stretched. Harry could hear a faint drip somewhere in the back of the shop. Then the wizard reached beneath the counter and pulled out a scrap of parchment. A self-inking quill scratched across it with quick, decisive strokes. He shoved it toward Harry. Tomorrow night, midnight, that address. Ask for Corvus. Harry took the parchment carefully, forcing his face to remain neutral, even as his stomach clenched. Midnight, Harry repeated, as if confirming a dinner reservation, rather than a meeting that smelled like a trap. Don't be late, the wizard said, voice hardening. Corvus doesn't like waiting. And don't bring anyone you wouldn't trust with your life. Ron swallowed. Hermione's eyes flicked down to the parchment and back up, calm, cold, focused. Harry nodded. Understood. They left the shop without hurrying, because hurrying would mark them. They walked with measured steps through the narrow corridor of the alley, past shop windows that seemed to watch, past shadows that shifted and whispered. Only when they stepped back into Diagon Alley, only when warm light spilled across the cobblestones and the air smelled of bread and ink and ordinary life, did they let themselves breathe fully. Ron exhaled first, long and shaky. Well, he said, voice low, that was revolting. But it worked, Hermione said tightly. We've got a contact. We've got a meeting, Harry corrected. And it's at midnight, in an abandoned building, at an address that sounds like it comes with a complimentary disappearance. Ron stared at him. That's alarmingly accurate. Hermione's fingers had tightened around her bag strap. We need to tell Robards immediately. We don't go near that place without backup. Harry agreed before she even finished speaking. We don't go alone. They returned to the ministry through the quieter entrance, avoiding the main atrium and its constant eyes. Down in the Auror office, the evening shift was rolling in, tired faces, brisk voices, Aurors shrugging off cloaks as they prepared for nights of surveillance and paperwork, and ugly work that didn't wait for anyone's comfort. Robards listened to their report in silence, eyes fixed, expression unreadable. When Harry handed over the scrap of parchment, Robards read the address once and gave a small, humorless exhale. Good, she said. Better than I expected. You made contact. You got a name. You got a time. Ron's eyebrows jumped. Is that praise? Roberts gave him a look that suggested he should never ask that again. It's a result. Hermione leaned forward. We're not walking into that building tomorrow without serious support. You won't, Robards said. We'll have a team in position. Disillusionment, perimeter wards, emergency extraction. You'll go in, you'll do exactly what you did today. Ask questions, listen, observe, and you leave. And, if it's a trap? Ron asked bluntly. Robards's gaze sharpened. Then we pull you out, immediately. You are trainees, not martyrs. Harry felt something loosen slightly in his chest. Still, the knot remained, because deep down, dear listener, he could feel it. The sense that they had stepped onto a path that didn't end cleanly. That nocturne alley didn't hand out single leads without taking something back. That night, at Grimmauld Place, they sat around the kitchen table as if it were a war room. Hermione wrote lists. Everything that could go wrong, everything that might be a warning sign, every question they needed to ask, without sounding like interrogators. Ron paced, mapping scenarios like chess moves, predicting what kind of man Corvus might be, and how a meeting at midnight might unfold. Harry sat with his hands wrapped around a cooling mug of tea and tried to calm the familiar edge of pre-battle awareness in his blood. At last, Hermione looked up, her voice quiet. We don't have to do this. We can tell Robards we're not ready. Harry met her eyes. We could. Ron paused his pacing. But we won't. Hermione's gaze sharpened. Why not? Harry found the answer slowly, honestly. Because this is what we chose. Because there are people out there still selling hate and suffering, just dressed up in different clothes now. Because after everything, we can't pretend it's gone. Ron's mouth tilted into something half wry, half sincere. You're noble. Also, possibly unwell. Probably both, Harry admitted. Hermione's shoulders eased a fraction. Together, then. Always, Ron said. And so, dear listener, beneath the warm light of a kitchen that had once been cold and haunted, three friends made their choice. Not because the world insisted, but because they still believed there were things worth standing for. Tomorrow they would walk toward darkness with backup waiting, and fear tucked away behind steady faces. Tomorrow they would meet Corvus at midnight, and the alley would show its teeth. Midnight has a particular texture in the wizarding world, dear listener. Not merely the absence of daylight, but a hush that feels deliberate, like the air itself is holding its breath. Streets empty, shop shutters draw tight, homes dim their lamps. And in the older parts of magical London, where history lies thick in the stones, the shadows seem to gather with purpose. Harry, Ron, and Hermione arrived at the edge of Knockturn Alley, a little before the hour. Not rushing, not lingering. Moving like people who belonged to the night and had nothing to fear from it. They did not look at each other too often. They did not whisper. They did not check the time more than once. Still, Harry could feel his pulse under his skin, like a drum kept too close. Above them, clouds slid across the narrow ribbon of sky, occasionally revealing a pale coin of moonlight that made the alley's cobblestones shine wetly. The buildings leaned in the same conspiratorial way as before, their windows dark, their signs shifting when your eyes tried to fix them into certainty. Tonight, though, the street felt even quieter than it had the day before. Quiet, Harry knew, was not safety. Quiet was anticipation. They reached the address written on the scrap of parchment, an abandoned building on the very edge of Knockturn, where the alley thinned and the air grew colder, as if warmth refused to travel that far. The structure might once have been a storage house, or a shop, or a place where people met when they didn't want to be seen. Now it was a hulk of brick and crooked wood, its windows boarded over, its door scarred by old scorch marks that hadn't been caused by candle flame. Ron stared at it, then at Harry, then at Hermione. Well, he murmured, barely moving his lips. This is charming. Hermione's voice came softly, measured. Remember, we don't take the lead by force. We take it by patience. Harry nodded once and adjusted his sleeve, letting his fingers brush the small charm hidden there, an emergency signal keyed to the Aurors waiting nearby. They were close, disillusioned, silent, perimeter wards humming faintly under the stones. Robards had promised them backup. Backup, Harry had learned, was not the same thing as certainty. They stepped toward the door. A faint enchantment stirred as they approached, something that felt like a cool hand moving over the surface of their skin, searching for intent. Hermione stiffened almost imperceptibly, as if recognizing the shape of the magic. Harry kept his face neutral. Ron's expression settled into bored indifference, which, to his credit, he managed better than Harry would have guessed. Harry raised his hand and knocked. Once. Twice. The sound echoed oddly, as if the building swallowed it, and considered whether it was worth returning. A pause. Then the door opened just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness and a single pale eye. Yes, said a voice, smooth as oil. Harry didn't flinch. He held out the scrap of parchment like a calling card. We were told to ask for Corvus. The eye narrowed, assessing. The door opened wider. A man stood there, tall, lean, and pale, in a way that suggested he didn't spend much time under the sun. His hair was dark and carefully styled, and on every finger gleamed a silver ring, each one carved with delicate symbols that made Hermione's gaze sharpen with uneasy recognition. His smile arrived slowly, but it never touched his eyes. "Corvus," he said, as if tasting his own name. "Yes, that's me." His eyes moved over them with a predator's calm. Harry felt the instant uncomfortable awareness that Corvus was measuring not just their clothes or their confidence, but their fear, how well it was hidden, how deep it went, how it might be used. "You're young," Corvus observed. "New money," Ron supplied, letting a faint grin tilt his mouth, as if he found the whole thing amusing. "It spends the same." Corvus's smile widened by a fraction. "True. Come in, then." They stepped through the doorway. The air inside was colder, and it smelled of dust and old enchantments. The building had been stripped of anything that might suggest legitimate use. Empty shelves, bare walls, a cracked wooden staircase leading upward, though Corvus didn't take them that way. Instead, he led them down a narrow corridor into a room lit by a single hanging lantern that glowed with a dim, unnatural light. In the center of the room stood a long table. On it were objects arranged with deliberate care, like offerings on an altar. Harry's stomach tightened, not because he could immediately identify what each thing was, but because he could feel the wrongness rolling off them in faint waves, the way certain cursed places carried a chill even when the air was warm. Corvus moved to the table and clasped his hands behind his back, presenting the display with the smooth pride of a man showing off fine art. "I'm told you're interested in protection," he said. Hermione's voice was calm, steady, almost bored. "We're interested in options." "Options," Corvus echoed, amused. Such a careful word. "People who come here don't want options. They want certainty." Ron leaned one elbow on the table, as if none of this was impressive. "Certainty costs extra." Corvus's eyes flicked to him. "Certainty always costs extra." He gestured toward the objects. There was a small pendant shaped like a twisted claw, its metal dark and faintly greasy-looking, as if it had been handled too often by hands that sweated fear. Beside it lay a slim dagger with runes etched along the blade. Beautiful, precise, and unmistakably designed for harm. A compact mirror rested near the edge of the table, its surface clouded. Harry didn't want to look too long. Something about it made his thoughts itch. And there were other items, too. Bottles sealed with wax that carried a bitter smell even through the cork. A ring set with a stone that seemed to drink light. A folded piece of parchment that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. Hermione's gaze moved with controlled precision. She did not stare. She did not recoil. She simply noted silently, as if building a catalogue in her mind. "What do they do?" Harry asked. Corvus's smile sharpened. "That depends on the item and the buyer. Protection is not a single spell, mister." Harry hesitated the smallest moment. They had cover names. Robards had insisted, not because Corvus would accept them as strangers otherwise, but because any lie was a habit you practiced until it became easy. "Harding," Harry said smoothly. "Elias Harding." Corvus repeated it, as if committing it to memory. "Mr. Harding, protection is a relationship. Some people want a shield. Some want a warning. Some want revenge disguised as security." Ron's tone stayed casual. "And you provide all of that?" "I provide possibilities," Corvus corrected lightly. "Some of these," he tapped the claw pendant with one ringed finger, "will detect hostile intent and tighten your wards when danger approaches." He indicated the cloudy mirror. "That one will show you the face of whoever last spoke your name with hatred. Useful, if you prefer to know who to avoid." Hermione's eyebrows lifted just slightly. "And the cost?" Corvus's eyes gleamed. "Gold, of course, but also discretion, trust, a willingness to accept that the ministry does not approve of everything required to keep oneself safe." It was bait, dear listener. Words dressed as wisdom offered to see whether they would nod along. Harry felt Hermione's fury like a heat beside him, carefully contained. He felt Ron's tension under his casual posture. Harry kept his face still. He was not here to argue morals with Corvus. He was here to learn. "What about curses?" Hermione asked, voice cool. "Some of these feel older." Corvus's smile widened with approval. "Ah, you have a discerning sense. Yes, old magic is always more effective. Modern spellwork is neat and polite. It obeys rules. Old magic doesn't care about rules. It cares about results." Harry let himself look at the items again and forced his breathing to remain even. The objects were real. They were dangerous. But the most important thing wasn't the display. It was Corvus himself. Because Corvus wasn't acting like a lone seller. His confidence didn't come from being hidden in a dark room with a table of cursed trinkets. It came from something bigger behind him, from being part of a system he trusted to protect him. Harry chose his words carefully. "Where do you get these?" Corvus's eyes softened. False warmth, like velvet over steel. From people who know how to find them. From places that still remember what power looks like. From collectors who need to sell quickly. From vaults that were never meant to be opened. Ron's tone stayed light. "Sounds like you've got connections." Corvus shrugged. "Connections are only dangerous if you cannot control them." Hermione's fingers hovered near the cloudy mirror, not quite touching. "And if someone wanted something specific," Corvus's gaze sharpened, interest blooming, "then we could discuss it." Harry felt the thread tighten. This was the opening they needed. The point where a seller stopped showing off stock and started talking about supply chains. But before Harry could push further, the sound of footsteps came from the corridor behind them, not Corvus's steps. He moved like a man who wanted to be heard. Two more figures entered the room. One was a witch with scars down one side of her face, thin, pale lines that pulled her mouth into a permanent twist. The other was a large wizard whose shoulders seemed too broad for the doorway. His presence filled the space like a threat given shape. Neither smiled. Neither introduced themselves. They simply stood behind Corvus, silent, watching. A reminder, a warning. Corvus didn't turn to acknowledge them. He merely continued speaking, as if their arrival was as ordinary as a change in weather. "People underestimate how much still moves through this alley," he said softly. "They believe the war ended and darkness packed up its bags. But darkness is not a person, Mr. Harding. Darkness is a market." Harry's skin prickled. Hermione's eyes were steady, but Harry could see the tension at the corner of her mouth. Ron's fingers flexed once, then relaxed. "You're new," Corvus continued, voice almost gentle. "New to this world, new to what it means to choose your safety over your conscience. That's understandable." Ron's grin sharpened. "We're quick learners." Corvus's gaze lingered on him. "We shall see." He reached toward a small wooden box on the table and opened it with careful precision. Inside lay an amulet on a thin chain. The metal was dull, but it seemed to drag the lantern light inward like a slow breath. "This," Corvus said, "is the sort of thing people buy when they are truly afraid." Hermione's voice stayed controlled. "What does it do?" Corvus tilted his head. "It prevents spells from finding you." Harry's chest tightened. "A cloak charm?" Corvus's smile returned. "No. A refusal. The magic shifts away as if you are not there. It comes with conditions, naturally." "What conditions?" Ron asked. Corvus's eyes flicked to him with mild amusement. "The amulet must be fed." Hermione's tone cooled further. "Fed how?" Corvus didn't answer immediately. He watched them, one by one, gauging reaction, seeing who flinched first. Then he said softly, almost lovingly. It drinks from you, just a little, a fraction of your strength each day. A small cost if you value living. Harry felt sick, not because he hadn't expected cruelty from this world. He had lived through Voldemort, but because Corvus spoke of harm, the way some people spoke of tea, like it was ordinary, like it was nothing. Hermione's fingers tightened against her palm. Ron's jaw clenched. Harry kept his voice level. How much? Corvus smiled. Enough. Silence stretched. Harry knew they had to keep their cover. He knew they had to look interested. He knew they had to ask questions without revealing disgust. So he did what he'd learned to do during the war. He split himself in two. The part of him that felt sick stayed quiet. The part of him that acted did the work. We'd need to think, Harry said, letting his eyes run over the amulet with deliberate interest. We don't buy without understanding the full arrangement. Corvus nodded, as if that was sensible. Wise. Hermione stepped forward slightly, her voice smooth. Do you work alone? Corvus's smile didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. No one with sense works alone. And your suppliers? Hermione pressed carefully, as if merely curious. Corvus lifted one shoulder. Here and there, across borders, magic doesn't respect lines drawn by politicians. Ron leaned a fraction closer, like someone with money who wanted to boast. So you're importing. Corvus's gaze lingered on him, amused. Sometimes. From where? Harry asked, as lightly as he could. Corvus's smile became colder. From places where people don't ask questions they can't afford. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was a confirmation, a network, not a man in an abandoned room. A system. Harry let his eyes flick toward Hermione and Ron, quick as a blink. They understood. They had what they came for. Proof that this was larger than a single shop. Proof that Robards wasn't chasing a small-time seller. Now, they needed to leave without raising suspicion. We'll come back, Harry said, letting his voice carry the weight of a promise. We're serious. We just want time to decide what sort of protection is worth the cost. Corvus's eyes narrowed as if weighing the sincerity. Then he smiled again, smooth as ever. You'll come back, he agreed, like a man stating fact rather than hope, because fear always brings people back. He closed the box with the amulet and slid it aside. As they turned toward the door, the scarred witch shifted slightly, just enough to block the path. Hermione stopped, expression calm but alert. Corvus's voice floated behind them. One more thing. Harry turned. Corvus studied them with an intensity that made Harry's scar prickle, though it did not burn. Nocturne Alley isn't forgiving, Corvus said softly. If you speak of what you see here to the wrong person, you won't get a second chance. Ron's smile was easy. We're discreet. Corvus's gaze lingered, and for a moment Harry had the sense of standing on a knife's edge. Then Corvus nodded once. The scarred witch moved aside. They walked out. The door closed behind them, with a quiet finality. Only when they reached the mouth of Nocturne Alley again, only when the air warmed by a degree and the noise of Diagon drifted faintly on the wind, did Harry let himself release a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Ron exhaled hard. That man is dangerous, Hermione finished, voice tight. And smug, Ron added. Which usually means protected, Harry said. They moved quickly but not obviously, following the route Robards had given them, turning down a side lane where the shadows were deeper. At a seemingly empty stretch of brick wall, Harry brushed his sleeve again. The emergency charm warmed. A heartbeat later, the air shimmered, and Robard stepped into view with 3 senior Aurors behind her, all disillusionment fading like mist. Robards's eyes flicked over them, heads, hands, Posture checking for injury without asking. Report, she said. Harry gave it, concise but detailed. The location, the security feel of the building, Corvus's rings and the scarred witch and the large man. The objects on the table, the amulet that fed, the way Corvus spoke of importing, of suppliers, of borders, the warning at the end. Robards listened without interrupting. When Harry finished, Robards' expression had hardened into something cold and purposeful. This confirms it, she said. He's a node, not the source. And he's confident because someone higher up is backing him. Hermione's voice sharpened. We need to shut him down before he moves anything. We will, Robards said, but there was no impatience in her tone, only grim discipline. Not tonight. We don't kick the door in without a full map. We build the case. We trace the chain. Ron's eyes flashed. And if he sells something like that amulet to someone desperate, if he sells, I know, Robards said, and for a moment something human crossed her face. But we do this properly, or he slips away and the network stays intact. You've seen how this works. Harry swallowed. He had. Robards looked directly at them. You did well. You didn't push too hard. You didn't flinch. You got confirmation of international supply. Hermione's hands were clenched. He invited us back. Robards nodded once. Good. That means he thinks you're useful. Harry felt a chill. Or he's testing us. Both, Robards said simply. Go home, sleep. Tomorrow you debrief again, formally. Then we decide the next step. They returned to Grimold Place in the hour after midnight, when London's streets were at their quietest, and even the magical world seemed to drift on slower currents. The house felt warmer than the alley had, but not warm enough to push the cold out of Harry's bones. In the kitchen, Hermione poured tea with hands that trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. Ron sat hard in a chair and stared at the wall for a long moment, as if trying to convince himself he was no longer in that room with the lantern light and the table of wrongness. Harry stood by the sink and watched water run over his fingers. Too hot at first, then too cold, unable to find a temperature that felt right. He grabbed the room, Hermione said quietly after a while. Did you notice? Not the way he stood, but the way he spoke, like he owned the air. Ron's voice came rough. He enjoyed it. Harry nodded once. He's used to people being afraid. Hermione swallowed. The amulet. That's not just illegal. That's evil. Ron finished, and his face tightened with the memory of it. Harry leaned back against the counter. He's selling fear back to people. He's turning panic into profit. Hermione's eyes flashed. And he's talking about borders, suppliers, importing. Ron dragged a hand through his hair, which means there's more of him. More sellers, more rooms like that. Harry's chest felt tight. A year ago, they had fought a Dark Lord. The evil had been huge and obvious, and wrapped in a single name. Now the evil was ordinary. A market, a chain of hands exchanging cursed objects like merchandise. A network that would keep moving even if Corvus vanished tomorrow. Hermione's voice lowered. We have to stop it. We will, Harry said, but his voice sounded older than he wanted. Ron's laugh came out without humor. Yeah, we're trainees. What could go wrong? Hermione shot him a look that would have once made him apologize instantly. But tonight, he didn't. Tonight, none of them had spare softness to waste. Harry stared at the tea in his cup until it went cold, and wondered, quietly, privately, how many people in the wizarding world were already buying things like that amulet? How many desperate souls were being told that living required sacrifice, and believing it because fear makes people accept almost anything? Upstairs, the house creaked in the night. Wind pressed against the window. Somewhere in the city, Life went on, unaware of the small room with the lantern light, unaware of the pale man with silver rings who sold protection like poison wrapped in silk. Harry slept eventually, but his dreams were thin and restless. And when morning came, bringing pale light and the sense of an ordinary day beginning, the memory of Corvus's calm smile did not fade, because the meeting had not ended with an arrest. It had ended with an invitation, and invitations in places like Nocturne Alley were never given without a reason. The days after the midnight meeting moved with a strange double speed, dear listener, both slow and relentless. On the surface, everything looked ordinary. The ministry continued to hum. Memos still fluttered in crisp formations above the atrium. Clerks still argued about filing spells and departmental budgets. Witches and wizards still hurried to work with coffee in one hand and parchment in the other, convinced their morning was the most important in the world. And yet, beneath that ordinary rhythm, something had shifted. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had stepped into a current that didn't run on schedules or rules. They had touched the edge of a market that thrived on secrecy, desperation, and old grudges that refused to die even after a war had ended. Corvus had not simply shown them cursed objects. He had shown them a doorway, a threshold, a quiet suggestion that darkness didn't need a Dark Lord to survive. It could survive perfectly well as business. Robards kept them busy, which was both a kindness and a strategy. The formal debrief the next morning was conducted behind layered privacy charms in a small secure room off the Auror office, a space that smelled faintly of old stone and warding incense. Robards sat at the head of a narrow table with two senior Aurors beside her, grim-faced witches and wizards who wrote without looking down, their quills moving like insects across parchment. Harry repeated everything: the layout, the objects, the amulet that fed, the security feel of the building, the two silent associates, the way Corvus watched them like a man measuring cloth. Hermione added details Harry hadn't noticed, symbols on Corvus's rings that suggested certain old magical families, the faint trace of suppression mesh used to dampen artifact magic, the particular shape of the lantern light, which she suspected was produced by a bound, low-grade spectral charm, rather than an ordinary illumination spell. Ron, meanwhile, described Corvus's posture and timing, how he paused before each reveal, how he let silence do half his threatening for him, how he used the scarred witch like a physical punctuation mark. Robards listened, expression carved from restraint. When they finished, she leaned back slightly and steepled her fingers. "You did well," she said. And if it wasn't exactly warmth, it was honest recognition. "Now we decide how to pull the thread without letting the whole thing snap." Hermione's voice was calm, but the tightness behind it betrayed her anger. "Why don't we raid him? We have enough to arrest him for possession and distribution." "We have enough to arrest him," Robards agreed. "We do not have enough to dismantle what's behind him. You raid Corvus, he disappears. If you catch him, he takes the fall. The suppliers vanish. The buyers vanish. The chain continues with a different name at the door." Ron's jaw worked. "So we keep going back. We keep going back," Robards confirmed. "Not to buy more than necessary, not to get reckless, but to get the map." Harry felt the old war instinct stir, the part of him that wanted to strike fast, end it clean. But he had already begun to learn what Robards was teaching them, whether he meant to or not. In war, speed could win. In law, speed could destroy your own case. "Here's what happens next," Robards said, and her voice sharpened into command. "We put Corvus under surveillance, quiet surveillance. We identify his routes, his meeting points, his points of contact. We find the suppliers. We find the distribution chain. We find where the money goes. And you three," her eyes fixed on them, "continue as buyers, carefully. You're our door back into his confidence. Harry's stomach tightened. And if he's testing us, he is, Robard said simply. That's why you don't take risks you can't explain. You don't improvise without a signal. You don't separate. You don't let him isolate one of you from the others. Hermione nodded, already planning. Ron's expression was set. The humor drained away. Harry asked the question that sat at the edge of all of it. Do you think he knows who we are? Robards' gaze didn't flicker. Not officially, but he knows you're not ordinary buyers. The question is whether he thinks you're dangerous enough to matter. Ron let out a short breath. Brilliant. So we're trying to convince a criminal we're useful, but not useful enough to kill. That, Robards said, is undercover work. The first return visit happened 4 days later. Early evening, not midnight. Corvus had sent word, through a boy in Nocturne with dull eyes and a charm-marked wrist, that new stock had arrived and certain clients were being given first look. Robards didn't like the sudden invitation. It smelled like acceleration. Like Corvus was either eager or curious, but avoiding it would be worse. Refusing an invitation from someone like Corvus was how you ended up on a list. So they went. This time the building felt different, though Harry couldn't have said how at first. The air inside was warmer, the lantern was brighter, the light more golden than grey, as if Corvus wanted the room to seem less like a den and more like a showroom. The table was rearranged. The objects were fewer, more deliberate. Corvus greeted them with the same smooth smile. Mr. Harding, he said, nodding toward Harry. Miss? Hermione held his gaze without blinking. West. Corvus repeated it, as if tasting the syllable. Miss West. And your tall friend. Ron spread his hands in careless elegance that would have looked comical on anyone else, but on Ron it landed with a surprising ease. Belle. Corvus smiled again. Good. I appreciate people who understand the importance of names. Harry felt the subtle warning under the words, I will remember you. I will track you. I will look for the cracks in your story. Tonight, Corvus seemed more conversational. He offered them seats, 3 plain chairs brought in from somewhere deeper in the building. He produced a bottle of something amber and poured it into small glasses without asking if they wanted any. Hermione didn't touch hers. Ron lifted his and sniffed suspiciously. Harry kept his hand still. We didn't come for drinks. Corvus's smile widened. Of course not. You came for certainty. He began to show them items again, but differently now. Less like a man trying to impress strangers, more like a man selecting tools for people he was deciding whether to trust. A bracelet that warmed when hostile spells were cast nearby. A parchment charm that would darken if someone was lying in your presence. A coin that could be flicked onto a surface to reveal hidden wards. Hermione asked careful questions about the underlying magic. Ron asked about usage and limitations. Harry watched Corvus, watched which questions made him pause, which made him pleased, which made him guard his answers. And slowly, with each exchange, they built something that looked like rapport. It was nauseating in its own way, pretending to belong in that room, speaking politely about objects built to harm. But they did it. They smiled when necessary. They sounded curious when they felt sick, because the goal was not to feel clean. The goal was to stop the market. At the end of the visit, Corvus leaned back and steepled his ringed fingers. Tell me, he said softly, why 3 young people with money and ambition are shopping in Nocturne Alley. It was the first direct question of motive, the first real test. Hermione's face didn't change, but Harry saw the tension spike in her shoulders. Ron answered first, light and easy, because the world's full of surprises, isn't it? And the ministry's full of paperwork. Corvus's eyes flicked to Ron. That's not a reason. Harry stepped in, letting his voice go quiet. Because we lived through the war, he said, and he let a controlled bitterness color it. And we learned something the ministry refuses to admit. Sometimes the law is too slow to protect you. Sometimes you need something extra. Corvus studied Harry for a long moment. Then his smile softened into something almost approving. Yes, he murmured. That's the beginning of wisdom. Hermione's mouth tightened slightly, but she said nothing. Corvus leaned forward. If you want to move beyond trinkets and petty wards, you'll need to prove you can be trusted. Ron's tone stayed careless. How? Corvus's eyes gleamed. A favor. Harry felt his blood go cold. A favor, Hermione repeated, carefully. Corvus nodded. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you can't walk away from. I have a client who is anxious. They need reassurance. They need to know that certain ministry eyes are not watching certain doors. I need someone who can move through public spaces without drawing the wrong attention. Someone who can listen, observe, and report. Ron's eyebrows lifted. Sounds familiar. Corvus smiled. It does, doesn't it? You do this favor. You come back with information. And then he tapped one silver ring against the table. We talk about real protection. Hermione's voice was cool. What kind of information? Corvus's gaze held hers. There is a storage facility. Not in Nocturne, not in Diagon, a neutral place. I need to know whether it's under watch. I need to know whether ministry patrol patterns have shifted in that area. Harry's mind raced. A storage facility could mean anything. Money, artifacts, creatures. If Corvus was asking about it, it mattered. Where is it? Harry asked. Corvus's smile returned. You'll receive the address when you agree. Ron's voice dipped, casual but sharp. And if we say no? Corvus tilted his head. Then you remain clients who browse and buy small. And eventually you stop coming. And eventually you are not relevant. The threat wasn't explicit, but it sat under the words, like a blade under cloth. Harry met Hermione's gaze for a fraction of a second. Silent communication. Years of practice. Hermione's eyes were hard with thought. Ron looked between them, waiting for Harry's cue. Harry nodded once. We'll do it. Corvus's smile widened. Excellent. He handed Harry a folded piece of parchment sealed with dark wax. 2 nights from now, you observe. You do not interfere. You report back. Harry took it with steady hands. They left the building with the faint sensation of having agreed to something that would change the shape of the entire case. Outside, the city air felt cleaner, though it was cold. Robards and the surveillance team met them in the arranged alleyway, disillusionment fading as they stepped into view. Favor, Harry said as soon as Robards approached. Robards' expression tightened. Explain. They did. Hermione described the test. Ron described Corvus's tone. Harry handed over the parchment. Robards read it once, face unreadable. Then she looked up. This is the first real hook, she said. This is what we need. This address is either a distribution point or a trap designed to identify threats. Ron's voice was blunt. It could be both. Roberts' mouth twitched. Yes, which is why we handle it properly. The next 2 nights were thick with planning. Roberts assigned additional backup teams, surveillance specialists, warding experts, a curse breaker who could identify protective magic from a distance. They mapped routes, created emergency extraction points, and layered protective charms onto Harry, Ron, and Hermione. That would trigger if their heart rate spiked suddenly. An automatic warning to the Aurors watching. Hermione didn't sleep much. She reviewed legal parameters for undercover cooperation, arguing with a senior Auror about how far they could go without crossing into entrapment. Ron trained relentlessly. practicing quick silent signals and counter curses. Harry sat in Grimold Place's kitchen late at night with a cup of tea he didn't drink, feeling that old familiar edge settle into his nerves, the sense that a wrong step could get someone killed. On the night of the favor, they didn't go alone. They never went alone. Robards' team blanketed the area around the address with concealment and monitoring charms. The storage facility itself sat on the edge of a Muggle industrial district, an unremarkable warehouse among many, the sort of place that would disappear into the background of anyone's gaze. Which, dear listener, was always suspicious, because criminals loved places that felt forgettable. Harry, Ron, and Hermione approached on foot, dressed as they had been before. Dark clothes, no identifying marks, wands hidden but ready. They moved like shadows among shadows. The warehouse didn't look guarded, but it didn't feel empty. Hermione's eyes narrowed. Wards, she breathed softly. Harry felt it too, a faint pressure against his skin, like walking through thin webbing. Ron muttered, "Brilliant. I love webbing." They circled wide, keeping distance, doing exactly what Corvus had ordered. Observe, do not interfere. They watched for movement. A door opened briefly on the far side. A figure stepped out, hooded, face obscured by a glamour charm. They carried a crate. Another figure appeared, taller, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Hermione's breath caught. That crate. Look at the mesh. Harry squinted. Silver mesh. Suppression mesh. The kind used to dampen magic. The kind used to transport dangerous objects. Or creatures. Ron's voice tightened. They're loading. Harry's pulse thudded. This was the first time they were seeing the network in motion, not as curated showroom items, but as supply. A carriage appeared, small, plain, charmed to look like a delivery cart to any Muggle who glanced at it. The hooded figures slid the crate inside. Another crate followed, then another. Harry felt the urge to signal, to rush, to stop it, but Robards' rules rang in his mind like iron. Do not interfere without full containment. They were there to map, to identify. So they waited. And then, as if the night itself decided to sharpen, something changed. A third figure stepped out of the warehouse, and the glamour charm on their face faltered for half a second. Just half. But Hermione's eyes were too sharp, and she stiffened like someone struck by a spell. "Hermione," Harry whispered. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze locked onto the figure with a cold intensity that frightened Harry more than the warehouse wards did. "I know him," she breathed, and there was something like fury in her voice. "I've seen him." Ron's expression hardened. "Where?" Hermione's jaw tightened. "At the Ministry." Harry felt the ground tilt under him. "What?" Hermione's eyes stayed fixed on the figure. "Not an Auror, not our department. But Merlin, yes, I remember. He was in the Wizengamot corridor during the Yaxley hearings. A clerk, or an assistant, someone who worked in administrative services." Ron's voice went very quiet. "You're saying ministry staff are at a warehouse loading suppression-meshed crates?" Hermione nodded once, slow and deadly. "Yes." Harry's scar didn't burn, but his instincts screamed. Because this wasn't just a nocturne dealer. This wasn't just smugglers. This was the thing that haunted every institution. Rot inside the walls. Ron swallowed. "We need to tell Robards now." Harry's fingers brushed his sleeve. The signal charm warmed, then pulsed. A heartbeat later, the night air shimmered as an Auror stepped into view, disillusionment dropping away. Not Robards herself, but one of her senior team, eyes sharp and face grim. "Report," the Auror whispered. Harry spoke quickly. "Crates, suppression mesh. loading into a disguised cart. And Hermione recognized one of them, Ministry staff. The Auror's expression tightened. "Stay where you are. Don't move." The Auror vanished again under disillusionment, and Harry's heart hammered as the implication sank deeper. Ministry staff. Involved. That meant Corvus's network wasn't simply avoiding law enforcement. It might be feeding on it. They kept watching because they had to. Because stopping the cart now without knowing where it went would be like grabbing one strand of a web and letting the spider escape. The cart rolled out from the warehouse a few minutes later, moving slowly at first, then picking up speed as it merged with the quiet night roads. And dear listener, this is where things shifted from uneasy to dangerous. Because as the cart disappeared into the darkness, a sound came from behind them, a soft scrape, a foot on gravel. Harry's body reacted before his mind did. He spun, wand already half drawn. Ron was faster, his wand fully out, pointed into the shadow between two stacked pallets. Hermione's eyes flashed, but her voice stayed calm. "We're not alone." A figure stepped forward, hooded, glamour charmed, their face blurred like a reflection in rippling water. They held their hands slightly out, as if to show they weren't attacking yet. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said softly. Harry's blood went cold. This wasn't Corvus's favor. This was someone who had spotted them. Someone who had decided to find out who they were. Ron's voice was tight. "We're just passing through." The figure tilted their head. "No," they said. "You're watching." Hermione's wand rose, steady. "Move?" she said, voice like ice. "Now." The figure's shoulders lifted slightly, an almost casual shrug, and then the glamour charm snapped away for a brief, clear second. Harry saw the face, not fully, just enough. A man, middle-aged, neat hair, narrow eyes, a face that looked like ministry corridors, a face that looked like paper and ink and bureaucracy, a face that did not belong in a warehouse at midnight. Then the glamour returned. But it was too late. They had seen, and the figure knew they had seen. "You really shouldn't be here," the figure repeated. And this time there was threat under the softness. "Some mistakes can't be undone." Harry's wand came fully up. Ron shifted, ready. Hermione's eyes blazed with controlled fury. Behind them, hidden Aurors were watching, waiting for the signal that meant intervene now. Harry's fingers brushed his sleeve again. The charm warmed, and in the next breath, the night exploded into motion. The moment Harry's signal charm warmed beneath his sleeve, the air around them seemed to tense. Dear listener, like the night itself had noticed the shift and was deciding whether to strike first. The hooded figure in front of them didn't move quickly. That, Harry realized with a cold clarity, was the most frightening part. Whoever this was, they didn't need speed. They had confidence, the kind that came from knowing you weren't alone. Behind the glamour, the man's eyes remained fixed on them, bright with calculation. He didn't lift his wand yet. He didn't throw a curse. He simply stood there, blocking the narrow route back toward the street. "You really shouldn't be here," he repeated softly. Ron's wand didn't waver. "Funny. We were just thinking the same about you." Hermione's voice was calm, but it had the edge of something sharpened over years. "Step aside." The man tilted his head, considering, as if they were negotiating a price rather than facing a confrontation in a cold, warded corner of an industrial lot. "And if I don't?" he asked. Harry felt his heartbeat thud in his throat. He glanced just once toward the warehouse. The disguised cart was gone. The crates were gone. Whatever had been moved tonight was already on its way to wherever it was needed, which meant their value, right now, was not in stopping the shipment. Their value was in identifying the person standing in front of them, in taking him, in breaking the first layer of the rot. "We'll move anyway," Harry said quietly. The man's lips curved. No, he said again, and then his voice cooled. You won't. He flicked his wand. Not a curse. A flare. A brief pulse of pale light that vanished into the night like a signal fire, seen only by those who were waiting for it. Harry's stomach dropped. Down, Hermione snapped. A split second later, 3 figures burst from behind a stack of crates to their left. Fast, practiced, already casting. The first spell hit the ground where Harry's head had been. It exploded in a spray of grit and sharp stone fragments that stung his cheek. Harry rolled, came up on one knee, and threw a shield charm. Ron was already firing back. His stunner caught one attacker square in the chest, sending them crashing backwards with a thud that echoed against corrugated metal. Hermione's voice was crisp. 2, left. No, 3. A 4th figure appeared on the far side, moving like a shadow made solid. Their attackers weren't Death Eaters in masks, dear listener. They weren't dramatic. They were neat, efficient, and terrifyingly calm. The kind of people who did violence as part of a routine. Harry's shield charm flared as another curse struck it. Purple light, spiderwebbing across the air. The force drove him back 2 steps, boots skidding on gravel. Ron snarled something under his breath and cast again. Hermione moved with sharp precision, sending a binding jinx that wrapped one attacker's ankles and yanked them to the ground. And through it all, the first hooded man, the ministry-faced man, stood back, watching like a supervisor, observing his employees. Harry's mind snapped into a ruthless focus. This was not random. This was containment. They had been spotted, and someone had decided, don't kill them, not here, not loudly. Subdue them, take them, erase the problem. Because, if they were taken alive, whoever ran this operation could learn exactly what they knew. Harry's scar didn't burn, but his instincts screamed. They wanted him. They wanted Hermione. They wanted Ron. They wanted information. Harry's fingers brushed his sleeve again. The emergency charm pulsed, and then the night around them shimmered. A wave of disillusionment broke like a spell-drawn curtain being yanked away. Auras appeared on rooftops, behind pillars, between stacked shipping pallets. Wands lifted in synchronized motion, and suddenly the small skirmish became a trap, sprung from both sides. "Drop your wands!" a voice thundered. Roberts's voice, iron and command, cutting through the chaos. The attackers hesitated for half a heartbeat. It was all the hesitation the Aurors needed. Stunners flew in rapid succession, clean, precise, overwhelming. One attacker went down. Another tried to apparate, but the anti-apparition ward snapped and hurled him sideways like he'd hit a wall. He slammed into the warehouse corner and crumpled. Hermione caught sight of the ministry-faced man turning to run. "No," she shouted, and her voice, usually controlled, split with fury. She fired a curse that wasn't lethal, but was vicious, a snapping tether that wrapped around his wrist and yanked him backward. He stumbled, his glamour flickered. For a clear second, Harry saw the face again. Sharp features, narrow eyes, the clean look of a man who spent his days among files and corridors. And then he raised his wand, not to attack, to vanish. A portkey. Harry recognized the movement instantly. The subtle twist, the hand going for something hidden in the palm. "Don't!" Harry yelled. But the man had already activated it. A flash of blue-white light erupted from his fist. And then, nothing happened. The portkey fizzled like a spell dying mid-breath. The man froze, disbelief flashing across his face. Robard stepped out of the shadows in front of him, wand steady, eyes cold. "You're on anti-portkey wards," she said softly. "Did you think we came unprepared?" The man's lips tightened. And then he did the thing that only desperate people do when their escape fails. He attacked. A cutting curse slashed toward Robards' throat. Robards didn't flinch. She twisted her wrist, deflected, and fired back so fast Harry barely saw it. A stunning spell that hit the man's shoulder and sent him staggering. He fought it, teeth clenched, trying to keep his wand up. Hermione moved like a storm, crossing the distance with frightening speed. Her spell struck his wand hand, numbing it, and Ron slammed in from the side, binding cords snapping around the man's arms and chest. He hit the ground hard. Silence fell in jagged pieces. Not total silence. There were still shouts as Aurors secured the remaining attackers. Still the crackle of warding charms being reinforced. But the immediate danger ebbed like blood, slowing after a cut. Harry stood, chest heaving, and looked down at the man they had captured. Now that the glamour was gone, he looked even more ordinary. That was what made Harry's skin crawl. He could have passed him in a corridor and never remembered his face, which meant that if Hermione had not caught that flicker, if she had not been Hermione, they might never have known a ministry thread was involved at all. Roberts crouched beside the man, her shadow falling across his bound body. "Name," she said. The man stared at her with quiet hatred. Robards didn't raise her voice. "Name." He swallowed once. "You don't have the clearance," he said, voice low and ugly. "You don't know what you're interfering with." Harry's stomach tightened. The same phrase. The same kind of arrogance. Robards' mouth twitched without humor. "We've heard that before." She tapped her wand once against the bindings, tightening them until the man winced. Hermione knelt, eyes burning. "I've seen you. You were in Wisengamot Administration Services. You were in the corridor during the Yaxley hearings." The man's expression flickered. Not fear, recognition. Then contempt. "Clever girl," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made Ron's grip tighten on his wand. Robards stood. "Take him," she ordered. "Secure transport, highest level holding. No communication, no counsel until we have initial verification. And lock down the warehouse." The Aurors moved like a machine. Two lifted the captured man and marched him toward a concealed exit route. Others swept the area, checking for hidden wards, concealed caches, evidence of what had been shipped out. Harry's pulse still hammered. He turned slowly, scanning the warehouse. "Where did the cart go?" Ron asked, voice tight. Robert's gaze was sharp. "We have trackers. It'll be followed." Hermione's hands trembled faintly as adrenaline drained out. "But we didn't stop it." "No," Robards said. "But we might have just caught the thread that explains how they stay ahead of us." Harry stared at the warehouse doors. Dark, closed, pretending innocence. He thought about suppression mesh, about crates loaded into a disguised cart, about a ministry employee standing here at midnight. It wasn't just smuggling. It was institutional protection, and that meant they were no longer dealing with simple criminals. They were dealing with corruption that wore official robes. Back at the ministry, the Auror office became a hive. Robards sealed 3 rooms with layered privacy charms. Evidence came in from the warehouse, spell residue readings, magical fingerprints, traces of transport spells. The 2 captured attackers were processed separately and kept under heavy guard. And the ministry-faced man, the one Hermione had recognized, was taken down to level 9 holding, the kind designed for high-risk magical criminals, with wards that made escape more difficult than breathing. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat in Robards' office, their robes dusty, hair disheveled, hands still carrying the faint tremor of what could have happened. Robards' scarred hands rested on the desk. "You understand what this means," she said quietly. Hermione nodded once, eyes fierce. "Someone inside the ministry is actively supporting the network. Ron's voice was rough. Or multiple people. Harry swallowed. And now they know we're watching. Robards' expression hardened. They already suspected. Tonight confirmed, you're not harmless buyers. Hermione's jaw clenched. Corvus set us up. Possibly, Robards agreed. Or the network has watchers at multiple points. Either way, the favor was a test and you passed. Unfortunately, passing means they'll escalate. Ron let out a humorless laugh. Of course they will. Robards leaned forward. We will not talk about tonight outside secured rooms. Not with other trainees. Not with friends. Not with family. Not even with colleagues you trust. Until we know exactly who is compromised. Anyone could be leaking. Understood. The words landed heavy. Harry felt something cold slide into place behind his ribs. The war had taught him how to fight enemies. It had not taught him how to doubt allies. Hermione's voice was very quiet. We need his name. Roberts's eyes narrowed. We will get it. Harry hesitated. How? Veritaserum? Roberts's jaw tightened. Restricted. High legal threshold. And if he has protections, occlumency, anti-truth charms, forcing it could backfire and compromise admissibility. Hermione looked like she wanted to throw something. Ron's eyes narrowed. So we do it the hard way. Robards nodded. We do it the lawful way, which is harder. They began the process that night. They pulled records. They reviewed attendance logs from Wesson-Gamot corridors. They cross-referenced security ward triggers near the warehouse with known ministry apparition signatures. Hermione worked like a storm, moving across files with brutal efficiency, muttering dates and names under her breath. Ron mapped patterns on paper like a chessboard, drawing arrows and noting travel routes. Harry watched them both and felt, for the first time in a while, the familiar steadiness of being part of a unit. Not three friends clinging to each other out of habit, but three investigators who could hold a case together when the world tried to split it apart. By dawn, they had narrowed the ministry-faced man down to a list of possibilities. Not a single name yet, but a list. 5 men who matched the approximate age and department placement. 5 men with access to hearings, corridors, and administrative security. 5 men who had shown unusual movement patterns on the night of the warehouse loading. Hermione stared at the list like she could burn it into truth with anger alone. One of these, she whispered. One of these people stood at that warehouse and tried to take us. Ron's voice was quieter. Which means one of these people has friends. Harry's stomach tightened again, because this wasn't just about corruption in the abstract. It was about a person who could sit at a desk in the ministry, file paperwork, nod politely to colleagues, and then walk into the night to help move cursed artifacts like cargo. Robards returned from a separate briefing with Kingsley Shacklebolt mid-morning, face drawn. She shut her office door and sealed it, then looked at them with a grim steadiness. The minister is authorizing a deeper internal investigation, she said. Quietly. He's furious, but he understands panic will spook the network. Hermione swallowed. What about Corvus? Robards' eyes narrowed. We will keep Corvus in play. We can't lose him yet. Ron's eyebrows shot up. After last night, you want us to go back? Robards didn't flinch. Not you. Not immediately. Harry felt a sharp relief. And then, in the next breath, a cold dread. So who? Someone who isn't famous. Someone who won't be a magnet. Someone we can afford to lose less visibility on. Hermione stiffened. You're replacing us as buyers. We're reducing your exposure, Robards corrected. You're too recognizable now. If Corvus, or his people, decide to test you again, they won't do it gently. Ron's mouth tightened. So what do we do? Robards leaned in slightly. You three are now internal. The words struck like a bell. Internal? Harry repeated. Robards nodded. You continue to work the case. But from the ministry side, you find the leak. You identify the compromised officials. You map who protected the warehouse shipment and who profits. Hermione's eyes flashed. So we're hunting the rot. Yes, Robards said. And you'll do it without anyone knowing you're doing it. Harry felt something twist in his chest, because it meant suspicion. It meant paranoia. It meant watching colleagues like they were potential enemies. It meant carrying secrets in a place built on paperwork and whispers. And it meant one more thing, dear listener, a truth that settled into Harry's bones with cold certainty. They were no longer just chasing smugglers. They were chasing power. That night, as the ministry's lamps glowed against the stone corridors, and the Auror office moved with a quiet, tense purpose, Hermione leaned close to Harry and Ron in their secure room. I want his name, she said, voice low and fierce. I want every person who helped him. I want every person who signed off on shipments, who moved files, who looked the other way. Ron nodded slowly, his face harder than Harry had seen in a long time. And we're going to get them. Harry looked at the wall where Hermione's map was beginning to grow again. Strings and names and dates, a spiderweb forming in real time. He thought of Corvus's calm smile. He thought of the warehouse. He thought of the way the ministry-faced man had tried to vanish. And he felt a grim, steady resolve take root. Yeah, Harry said quietly, we are. Because trust, once broken, changed the shape of everything. And somewhere inside the ministry's walls, the web was already shifting, tightening, adapting, preparing to defend itself. There is a particular kind of fear, dear listener, that doesn't come from standing in a dark alley with a wand in your hand. That fear is sharp, immediate, clean in its own terrible way. It either ends in escape or impact. But the fear that settled over the ministry after the warehouse was different. It was quieter. It lived in corridors and polite greetings. It hid in memos delivered with cheerful efficiency. It wore familiar faces and spoke in ordinary tones. It made you wonder not whether danger was coming, but whether it was already beside you, smiling. Robards's decision to move Harry, Ron, and Hermione internal didn't feel like a promotion. It felt like being placed inside a glass box and told to breathe carefully. Their new work was conducted in a secure room that officially didn't exist. If someone asked, it was a storage office, an overflow file space, a place where paperwork went to disappear. The door was charmed to look like blank stone, unless you knew where to put your hand and how to speak the innocuous phrase that opened it. Inside, wards layered the air like invisible walls. Spells hummed softly, constantly reaffirming privacy, blocking listening charms, scrambling unauthorized detection. Hermione loved it, not in the way someone loves comfort. There was nothing comfortable here, but in the way she loved anything that gave her a structure to fight within. She made the room hers in hours. A wide board was mounted on one wall. Strings were charmed to cling without nails. Dates were written in neat black ink, names in precise columns, connection lines drawn with brutal clarity. Ron, meanwhile, treated the room like a chessboard. He paced and stared and muttered patterns under his breath. He moved markers and changed assumptions and argued with himself in low tones until Harry thought his mind might be made of gears. Harry sat at the table with files spread before him and felt something in his chest tighten with a strange kind of grief, because he had wanted the Auror office to be home. He had wanted it to be ordinary, a place where he could be a worker among workers, a wizard with a job, not a symbol under a microscope. Instead, he was back where he had always been in some form, in the war within walls. Except now, the walls were supposed to be safe. Robards visited them twice a day, always at slightly different times, always with a different approach route. She spoke little. When she did, her words were sharp and economical. Evidence only. Assumptions kill cases. Trust no one until the paper says you can. Kingsley Shacklebolt had authorized a quiet internal investigation, but it couldn't be broad. It couldn't be loud. Panic would spook the network. Too many eyes would invite too many leaks. Instead, a small circle of senior Aurors and one trusted member from the Department of Magical Law remained in the loop. And within that circle, Roberts had given Harry, Ron, and Hermione a mission that felt almost impossible. Find the rot, but do it without letting the rot know it was being hunted. Hermione began with the simplest truth. People who betray systems leave trails, even if they think they're careful. They leave money trails, movement trails, communication trails, habit trails. So she requested access to internal security logs under the pretense of routine auditing after the Yaxley case. That pretense was strong enough to be believable. The ministry was hungry for the illusion of improvement, and auditing sounded like responsible governance. Ron focused on patterns of behavior. He built lists of who worked late, who visited restricted floors without clear reason, who rotated duties in ways that avoided oversight, who was always accidentally present when sensitive decisions were made. Harry worked the human angle, not with charm, not with fame, with listening. He took lunch in the atrium at odd times. He lingered near corridors where departmental staff gathered. He watched who spoke to whom. He watched who laughed too easily when certain names were mentioned, and who went quiet. They weren't interrogating people. They were collecting texture, because corruption doesn't just happen. It grows. It feeds. It creates small shifts in the air around those who are part of it. One of those shifts became clear within 2 weeks. Their captured ministry-faced man, still unidentified officially on paper, but tracked in their lists as warehouse witness, had not been acting alone. That was obvious, but the depth of his protection was worse than they'd feared. Every time Robards tried to push for his identity confirmation through official channels, fingerprint charms, employment records, magical signature comparisons, she hit soft resistance, not outright denial. Delays, lost requests, requests that returned incomplete. A clerk who smiled and apologized and said the form needed refiling. An administrative wizard who insisted the authorization stamp was wrong. A chain of minor obstructions that, when viewed individually, looked like bureaucracy. When viewed together, looked like sabotage. Hermione's face went cold when she laid the pattern out on their table. They're slowing us down. Ron stared at the list of delays. They're trying to buy time. Harry felt his stomach sink. To do what? Hermione's eyes lifted. To move. To hide. To erase. They needed to identify the obstructing hand. Not just the person who had been at the warehouse, but the person who could quietly gum up internal processes. Someone with access. Someone with influence. Someone who understood how to weaponize paperwork. Ron, of course, said it first. That's not a criminal trick, he murmured, tapping the parchment. That's an inside trick. Hermione nodded, which means our leak isn't just one man doing dirty work. It's an infrastructure. It was Harry who noticed the first concrete clue. A memo. A harmless-looking parchment that fluttered onto a desk in the Auror office with dozens of others. The title was bland, Security Routine Accesses Rotation. Most people would skim it and shrug. Harry read it twice, because the name at the bottom, signed as the responsible party, caught his attention. Crispin Rowell. Harry froze. The Rowell family name was old, pure blood, the kind that had leaned into Voldemort's world like a comfortable chair, then leaned out again when it became inconvenient. Crispin Rowell wasn't a known Death Eater, not officially. But he was a mid-level administrator in the ministry's internal security division, exactly the kind of person who could control access logs, shift patrol patterns, and lose requests. Harry brought the memo back to the secure room. Hermione's eyes sharpened instantly. Ron leaned closer, brows furrowing. "He's changing access rotations," Hermione said slowly. "But why now?" Ron's voice was quiet. "Because someone needs access. Or because someone needs denial of access," Harry thought, though he didn't say it yet. Hermione began pulling Raoul's records carefully, under legitimate pretexts. No sudden requests, no red flags. She did it the way she did everything, painstakingly and correctly. What she found, 2 days later, made her go still. "Raoul has been reassigned 3 times in the last year," she said softly, eyes fixed on the parchment as if it might bite. "Each reassignment puts him near sensitive cases. First, evidence room oversight, then internal security patrol planning, then Weisengamot corridor access." Ron's lips tightened. "That's not random." Harry's throat felt dry, and he signed the memo. Hermione nodded once, which means he has his hands on the door locks. The next step wasn't immediate confrontation. It wasn't even surveillance. Not at first. It was a test. They needed to see whether Raoul was simply incompetent and overworked, or deliberately manipulating the system. So Hermione created something false. Not a full fictional investigation like the Yaxley trap. Too large, too risky. A small bait document, a shipment notification. She drafted a routine-looking internal notice about a transfer of high-risk seized artifacts, scheduled to move through a specific corridor on level 2 at a specific time. The artifacts were fictional, but the notice looked real. It used correct formatting, correct stamps, correct phrasing, and most importantly, it was placed where only a certain circle would see it. A circle that included Raoul. Then they waited. The corridor in question was quietly monitored by disillusioned Aurors, positioned to observe without being seen. Harry, Ron, and Hermione watched from their secure room through a viewing charm that displayed a faint, ghostly image of the hallway like a moving photograph. For an hour, nothing happened. Then, 15 minutes before the shipment, Crispin Rowell appeared. He walked with the calm stride of a man doing his job. He paused at the junction. He looked both ways. Then he flicked his wand, murmuring a spell so quiet it barely registered. Hermione's breath caught. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Ron's eyes narrowed. He just did something to the ward line. Harry's stomach tightened. He's altering the corridor wards. Rowell moved on. And then, exactly 5 minutes later, 2 unfamiliar wizards arrived. They weren't Aurors. Their robes weren't ministry. They moved like people who expected no resistance. They walked directly toward the corridor where the shipment was supposedly coming. Harry felt his blood go cold. They took the bait, which meant the bait had been delivered, which meant Rowell was connected. Robards watching with them gave a single sharp nod. "Move," she said. The auras in the corridor sprung. Disillusionment dropped. Wands rose. Commands rang out. The 2 unfamiliar wizards tried to run. One attempted apparition and slammed into the ward barrier with a startled curse. The other threw a cutting hex that hit a shield and dissolved into sparks. They were stunned and bound within seconds. Raoul, meanwhile, stood frozen at the end of the corridor, face pale. His eyes darted, not with innocent confusion, with calculation, with recognition that the trap had snapped shut around him. Robert stepped into view, in the corridor image, her wand steady as a blade. "Crispin Rowell," she said, voice low and deadly. "You're going to explain what you just did." Rowell's face tightened. "I don't know what you mean," he said quickly. I was Roberts cut him off. You altered a security ward line. You created an opening. Raoul's eyes flicked to the captured men, then back to Robards. He licked his lips. Then, dear listener, he did something that made Harry's skin go cold in a different way. He smiled, not wide, not friendly, just a small, brittle curve of his mouth. You don't understand, Raoul said quietly. You really don't. Harry felt a slow dread roll in his gut, because that sentence didn't come from fear. It came from someone who believed he wasn't the one trapped. Robards stepped closer, her voice like iron. Explain. Raoul's smile tightened. You think you're digging out rot, but you're standing on a foundation built from it. Harry's hands clenched under the table in the secure room. Hermione's face was white with fury. Ron's jaw was rigid. Robards' voice remained steady. You're under arrest. Then his gaze shifted slightly, past Robards down the corridor. Harry followed it instinctively, and he saw what Raoul had been looking at. A ministry worker. Just a worker, pushing a trolley stacked with folded robes and parchment bundles. The sort of trolley that moved through corridors every day. The kind no one noticed. The trolley reached the junction. The worker paused, and then the trolley's wheels stopped being trolley wheels. They locked. They changed shape. Metal unfolded. Runes lit. Hermione's breath came out in a strangled sound. That's not explosion. It wasn't fire. It wasn't smoke. It was force. A burst of compressed spell energy that slammed outward like a giant's fist. The corridor image in their secure room shook. The viewing charm flickered violently, as if the spell itself had been struck. Harry's heart slammed into his ribs. The screen cleared just enough for them to see auras thrown backward, robes snapping like flags. Robards staggered, shield up, but even her shield bent under the impact. The captured wizards, still bound, were knocked unconscious by the blast. And Raoul used the moment. He whipped his wand up and shouted a spell. A portkey flare. Harry's stomach dropped. Roberts had warded against portkeys, but this wasn't a simple one. This was ministry-level magic, layered, coded, designed to slip through cracks. The corridor image blurred as the air warped. Raoul vanished. Not with apparition, not with smoke, with a sharp crack like reality itself being bitten. Robards fought her way upright, robes dusty, face grim. She barked orders. Auras moved, sealing exits, throwing counterwards, chasing echoes. But Harry already knew. Raoul was gone. And the message of the attack was unmistakable. This wasn't just someone taking bribes. This was a network willing to strike inside the ministry, inside the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, to protect itself. Hermione's hands shook violently now, no longer hidden. They planted a bomb, she whispered, voice raw. They planted something like that inside the ministry corridors like it was nothing. Ron's eyes were wide and furious. They could have killed Robards. Harry felt cold anger burn behind his ribs. Not the wild rage of grief, the controlled anger of clarity. They were being warned. Stop digging, or we'll bury you. Robards appeared in their secure room 10 minutes later, moving stiffly. A thin line of blood ran from her temple. Her eyes were bright with pain and fury. We have casualties, she said, voice clipped. 2 Aurors injured, 1 badly. No deaths. Harry's breath released in a shaky exhale. Hermione's eyes flashed. They meant to kill you. Roberts didn't deny it. They meant to make a point. And they succeeded. Raoul escaped. Raoul escaped. Roberts' jaw clenched. Yes. Hermione's voice sharpened. which means he had help. Robards nodded, which means our internal list just got longer. Harry stared at her, and Raoul knows we're onto them. Robards met his gaze. They all know now. Silence settled in the secure room, thick with the weight of what had changed. Before, the network had operated in shadows, careful, cautious. Now it had shown teeth in daylight. And once a hidden enemy reveals itself, dear listener, the world never feels safe in quite the same way again. Hermione swallowed hard. So what now? Robards' eyes went cold. Now. We stopped playing defense. She moved to the board Hermione had built and placed her hand flat against the strings. Raoul used a ministry-grade portkey, she said. That magic is coded. It leaves signatures. We can trace it if we move fast. Ron's brows furrowed, but only if we know where to look. Roberts's gaze sharpened. And we do. She pointed to a name Hermione had circled days ago, almost as an afterthought. A quiet figure in international magical cooperation. Someone who moved documents across borders. A person who could authorize special transport. A person who could make coded portkeys. Roberts tapped the name once. Elaine Voss, she said. Hermione's eyes widened. She was on my suspects cluster. But you didn't push, Robards said. Because you didn't have enough. Now we do. Harry felt the shift. The case was no longer slowly tightening. It was accelerating. Because the network had made a mistake. It had struck too hard, too openly. And now there was blood on the ministry floor. The kind of blood that made careful people reckless. Roberts looked at Harry, Ron, and Hermione with a grim steadiness. You wanted to root out corruption, she said. This is it. This is the heart of it. And if we don't cut it out now, they'll cut out pieces of us until there's nothing left. Ron's voice was low. So we go after Voss. Hermione nodded, eyes burning. We trace the portkey coding. Harry's hands clenched. And we find Raoul. Robards' mouth tightened. Yes, all of it. Fast. And, dear listener, in that moment, the quiet safety Harry had hoped, the ministry could become shattered completely. It was no longer a place of law and order that needed gentle reform. It was a battlefield in robes and corridors, and the next move would decide whether the network collapsed or whether it learned it could strike first forever. There are moments, dear listener, when the world narrows to a single thread. Not because nothing else exists, but because everything else becomes irrelevant. Noise at the edges of a room, while one truth stands in the center and demands to be answered. After the corridor blast, after Raoul's escape, after the cold knowledge that someone had turned a ministry trolley into a weapon, Harry, Ron, and Hermione felt that narrowing happen in real time. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was clarity. If the network could strike inside the ministry, then the ministry was not merely compromised. It was contested territory. And that meant every ordinary thing, every memo, every smile, every good morning in a corridor was suddenly suspect. A message could be a weapon. A delivery card could be a bomb. A friendly colleague could be a watcher. The old comfort of routine evaporated like mist in sun. Robards, bleeding slightly from her temple, and moving with stiffness that suggested bruises beneath her robes, looked at the three of them in the secure room and spoke with a quiet intensity that cut through shock. You don't get to be naive anymore, she said. Hermione's eyes were bright with rage and something like grief. We weren't. Robards' mouth twitched once, not quite a smile. No, but you hoped that the war taught the world a lesson. That peace would mean people wouldn't choose this kind of cruelty when they didn't have to. Harry felt the words hit something raw inside him, because they were exactly the hope he had never admitted aloud. Roberts didn't give them time to sit in it. She turned back to the board Hermione had made and tapped Elaine Voss's name again. Portkey coding, she said. It's not impossible to trace. It's difficult, but not impossible. Every portkey created under ministry authority leaves a signature. Most of it is buried in administrative enchantments. Most people never look. But our network isn't most people. Ron's voice was low. And Voss works international, magical cooperation. Hermione swallowed. So she can authorize cross-border transport, diplomatic channels, special clearances. Harry stared at the name, feeling that familiar cold focus settle in. And she can hide things in routine shipments. Robards nodded once. Exactly. The plan that formed in the next hour was the kind of plan that only people who had lived through war could build. Precise, layered, and shaped by the understanding that something would go wrong first. They needed portkey residue, not the residue of Raoul's escape itself. They'd already missed the cleanest window for that. But residue from the same system, the same coded style, because those codes weren't created fresh every time. They were templates, protocols, patterns repeated. If Voss had created or authorized Raoul's portkey, she would likely be using the same coded framework for other movements. So Hermione did what she always did when confronted with a system designed to hide itself. She attacked it with its own rules. She filed a legitimate request, not for portkey signatures directly. Too obvious, too suspicious, too likely to trigger defensive sabotage. Instead, she requested an audit of irregular transport authorizations linked to international cooperation measures enacted after the Yaxley case. The paperwork was real. The reason was plausible. The wording was careful. It was bureaucratic camouflage at its finest. And it worked. 2 days later, a stack of parchments arrived in their non-existent room. Hermione read them like a predator. Ron watched her face and could tell when she found something, because her eyes sharpened in a very specific way, as if the world had clicked into a new alignment. This, she said finally, tapping a line item. Harry leaned over. It looked boring. Most corruption did. Asterisk special transfer authorization. Diplomatic protective measures. Internal use only. Approved by E. Voss. Ron's eyebrows rose. Protective measures, my... Hermione cut him off, focused. Look at the date. Harry's stomach tightened. The night before the corridor blast. Robards' eyes narrowed. And the destination? Hermione traced the line. A temporary secure holding facility in Kent. Harry's mind snapped back to older pieces. Kent. The apothecary address. The personal owls. The earlier leak pattern. Kent had been a whisper in the background. Now it was a location on a ministry-approved transport authorization. Ron's voice went quiet. So, Kent is a hub. Or a handoff point, Harry murmured. Robards moved closer. We need to confirm it's tied to portkey coding. Hermione nodded and pulled out a small kit. Thin glass vials, silver dust, a rune-stamped lens. I can extract the signature from the authorization enchantment, she said. Not perfectly, but enough to compare if we get a second sample. She worked with careful precision. Silver dust drifted like glitter and then snapped into tight lines, forming a brief pattern in the air, a sequence of runes that flashed once and then faded. Hermione's face went pale with triumph and dread. I've got it, she whispered. Robards didn't waste time. The next stage wasn't an arrest, it was surveillance. Because you don't strike at a network that has already proven it can blow up a corridor inside the ministry, unless you know exactly how deep its teeth go. Aurors began quietly monitoring Elaine Voss's movements. Not obvious tailing, not shadowing in corridors. Something subtler. Ward triggers, signature logs, owl post routing patterns, flu network pings. And Harry, Ron, and Hermione did what they were best at. They became invisible in plain sight. Harry took the atrium routes he always took, stood in the same lines, nodded to the same faces. Hermione attended meetings and asked sharp, ordinary questions. Ron joked with trainees and played chess in the lunch break, like a man whose mind wasn't running 3 games at once behind his eyes. All the while, they watched. They waited for Voss to make the kind of mistake that careful people make when they're under pressure. And pressure, dear listener, was exactly what they applied. They planted another piece of bait, not something large enough to make the entire network move, something targeted. Hermione drafted a document suggesting that the ministry was implementing new magical signature verification on all international transfer authorizations, an internal security measure that would retroactively audit approvals from the past 6 months. It looked like a policy draft. It looked like bureaucracy. But to someone like Elaine Voss, it would look like a knife aimed straight at her throat. They placed the draft where she would see it. Then they waited. 3 days later, Voss made a sudden request for an unscheduled meeting. Not in her office, not in the International Magical Cooperation floor, in a private meeting room 1 level below, where transport authorizations were processed. That alone was suspicious. But what made Harry's stomach drop was what Ron noticed first. "She's not alone," Ron murmured, watching through the viewing charm as Voss entered the room. A second figure followed. Tall, narrow-shouldered, neat. And for half a second, as the viewing charm zoomed, Harry felt his blood turn to ice. Crispin Rowell. He looked tired. Harsher, but unmistakable. He was alive. Free. Still moving inside the web. Hermione's voice was a whisper made of fury. "He's back inside the ministry." Roberts's face went very still. "Not inside," she corrected. "Near it. Close enough to coordinate." Rowell wasn't wearing ministry robes. He wasn't strolling corridors openly. He was moving like someone using hidden routes, someone who had keys that shouldn't exist. And then, dear listener, something even worse happened. A third figure entered the room, an older wizard, hair touched with grey, moving with calm authority. Harry recognized him instantly, not because he'd worked closely with him, because everyone in magical law enforcement knew his name. Octavius Flint, a senior figure in ministry administration, long-serving, impeccably respectable, the kind of man who chaired committees and gave speeches about stability and tradition, the sort who shook Kingsley's hand in public and smiled for the prophet. Hermione went white. Ron's breath hitched. Harry felt cold spread through his limbs. Because if Octavius Flint was in a room with Elaine Voss and a fugitive like Rowell, then the web wasn't merely touching the ministry. It was rooted in it. Robert stared at the image, jaw tight enough to crack stone. "We don't move yet," she said, though every part of her body looked like it wanted to. "We record. We confirm. We don't blow this unless we can take all of them." Hermione's hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury so intense it had nowhere to go. They watched. Through the charm, they couldn't hear words, but Hermione adjusted the rune lens, tuning the spell to pick up fragments, tone, cadence, certain keywords that leaked through even heavy privacy charms. Audit, Voss's voice, tense. Move the stock, roll, harsher. You panicked, Flint, calm and scolding. Harry's stomach twisted. Stock. As if they were discussing barrels of ale. As if cursed artifacts and stolen creatures and human lives reduced to commodities were simply inventory. Robert's eyes narrowed. "We need sound." Hermione swallowed and altered the lens again, coaxing the charm to the edge of what it could ethically and magically do. The voices sharpened. If they trace the portkey code, it leads back to... Voss began. Flint's voice cut in, smooth as polished wood. They won't. Not unless someone very talented and very stubborn decides to make it their personal crusade. Hermione's eyes flashed. Raoul's voice came bitter. They already have. The girl, Granger, she's a problem. Harry's chest tightened. Flint's response was chilling in its calm. Then, remove the problem. Silence. Voss swallowed audibly. Inside the ministry, not necessarily, Flint said. Problems can be moved, or discredited, or persuaded to stop digging. Raoul's voice was cold. Persuasion didn't work at the corridor. Flint sighed faintly, like a man disappointed by poor workmanship. That was messy. Mess is what attracts attention. Ron's hand clenched around his wand. I'm going to kill him, he breathed. Hermione's eyes glistened with rage. No, we're going to arrest him. Robards' voice was very quiet. We're going to take all three. And then Flint said the words that made the room feel colder than Nocturne Alley had ever been. We do what we've always done, he said. We remind them the ministry is not theirs. It belongs to those who understand how to keep order. The war ended, yes, but power doesn't disappear. It changes clothes. Harry felt something inside him go very still. Because that was the core of it. Not ideology. Not even loyalty to Voldemort. Power. Old families. Old networks. Old entitlement. Wearing the mask of stability. Robards stood slowly, like a blade being drawn. That's enough, she said. We move now. The operation that followed was fast and brutal in its precision. They didn't storm the room immediately, not with shouted commands and flashy spells. They sealed exits first. They layered anti-apparition wards around the entire corridor cluster. They cut flue access quietly, so no one could vanish into green flame. They placed auras in the vents, on the stairs, behind walls under disillusionment, positioned at choke points, and then Robards walked to the door. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were with her. Not because she needed trainees, because they were the ones who had built the case, because they deserved to see the web snap. Robards didn't knock. She opened the door. The meeting room was small, lined with ministry-approved shelves and a long table. Elaine Voss sat rigidly, hands clasped. Raoul stood near the window like a caged animal, eyes sharp, wand half hidden in his sleeve. Octavius Flint sat at the head of the table as if he owned it. He looked up, calm. Roberts, he said pleasantly, to what do we owe the intrusion? Roberts's wand was already raised. Octavius Flint, Elaine Voss, Crispin Rao, she said, voice flat. You are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and aiding the trafficking network we have been investigating. Flint's eyebrows rose, mild amusement flickering. That's a very serious accusation. Hermione stepped forward, and her voice was ice. We heard you. Flint's gaze slid to her, assessing. Did you? Ron's wand lifted another inch. We did. For a moment, Flint looked almost bored. Then his eyes sharpened. Ah, he said softly. So you really are as stubborn as people say. Raoul's mouth curved into a thin smile. Told you. Voss's face had drained of color. She looked like someone who had convinced herself she could manage the edges of evil without becoming part of it, only to realize the edges had teeth. Flint leaned back in his chair. You don't understand, he said again. The same arrogant phrase that seemed to echo through every layer of the network. Your children playing at governance. You want justice. You want purity. You want the world to be simple. Harry felt anger rise, but he kept his voice steady. We want people to stop suffering for your profit. Flint smiled faintly. Suffering is not my concern. Order is. Stability. The ministry cannot be run by idealists who think every rule should serve every person equally. Hermione's eyes flashed. That's not order. That's entitlement. Flint's gaze stayed on her. Call it what you like. Raoul's body tensed, wand sliding fully into his hand. Robards' voice cut sharp. Drop your wand, Raoul. Raoul's grin widened. No. He moved. Fast. A curse shot from his wand toward Hermione. Harry reacted without thinking. Shield. Instinct. A flare of magic that caught the curse mid-air and deflected it into the wall, where it shattered a shelf into splinters. Ron fired back, stunning Raoul in the shoulder, but Raoul had protections. The spell hit and slowed him but didn't drop him. Voss screamed and ducked under the table. Flint stood, raising his wand with calm inevitability, and the room erupted. Spells ricocheted offwards. The air crackled with heat and ozone. Auras flooded in from hidden positions, disillusionment collapsing like curtains. Raoul fought like a man who had been doing this longer than anyone realized. Not sloppy violence, controlled, efficient. He aimed to disable, to create openings, to escape. Flint, meanwhile, didn't duel like a street criminal. He dueled like a man who believed rules were for other people. He cast old spells, complex, layered, designed to unravel shields by attacking the magic behind them, rather than the surface. Hermione met him head-on. Her face was pale with concentration, her wand moving with surgical precision as she countered with sharp, elegant defenses, unraveling his curses like threads pulled loose. Ron guarded her flank, firing stunners, binding spells, disruption charms that broke Flint's rhythm. Harry moved like he had in the war, fast, brutal in decision, using the space, the furniture, the angles. Raoul tried again to break through a side door and slammed into the anti-apparition and anti-portkey ward barrier. His face twisted with rage. Roberts' voice cut through the chaos like a sword. Raoul, down. She cast a spell Harry had never seen, a net of shimmering force that snapped around Raoul's limbs and pinned him mid-step, slamming him to the ground. Raoul snarled, fighting the net, but it held. Flint saw the shift, the moment his escape route collapsed, and his calm cracked for the first time. His eyes flashed with real anger. "You fools," he hissed. "Do you know what you're dismantling?" Hermione's voice was raw with fury. A trafficking ring. Flint's laugh was bitter. A system. Harry stepped closer, wand steady. A system that hurts people. Flint's face hardened. A system that keeps the world from collapsing under the weight of its own stupidity. Robards moved in, stunning him cleanly before he could cast again. Flint's body stiffened, then fell. Silence crashed down in the room like a door slamming shut. Voss sobbed quietly under the table, shaking. Auras moved swiftly, binding Flint and Raoul, securing wands, seizing evidence. Hermione stood very still, breathing hard, eyes fixed on Flint's unconscious form. Ron's chest rose and fell. His knuckles were white around his wand. Harry felt adrenaline drain out in a slow, sick wave. They had them. They had the heart. But as Robards had warned them long ago, endings were often beginnings in different robes, because arresting powerful people didn't automatically mean justice. It meant the fight moved into courtrooms, into politics, into public narrative, into the slow machinery of the very system Flint had believed he owned. Over the following weeks, the ministry shook, not with explosions, but with whispers. The Daily Prophet printed careful headlines. Asterisks, senior officials detained in internal investigation. Names were not always published immediately. Some stories were quietly suppressed. Others leaked anyway because truth has a way of slipping through even tightly controlled hands. Kingsley Shacklebolt convened emergency oversight hearings. The Wizengamot, fractured, proud, and furious, argued about jurisdiction, procedure, admissibility. Flint's defenders were loud, wealthy, persistent. They claimed political persecution, claimed overreach, claimed necessary stability measures. And then Hermione walked into the chamber with binders of evidence so thorough it made even the most stubborn traditionalists blink. She laid out the shipment authorizations, the coded portkey framework, the warehouse witness logs, the corridor blast analysis, the intercepted conversation, the paper trail of delays and sabotage. She did it with a calm that felt like a storm held in a glass. Ron testified too, unexpectedly devastating in his plain language. He spoke about patterns, about how the network moved, how it anticipated raids, how it used ministry corridors like safe streets. He spoke about the cost of order when that order meant protected criminals. Harry's testimony was the simplest and most painful. He talked about what he'd seen in Nocturne, the objects that fed on fear, the suppression mesh, the way people turned suffering into inventory. And he said something that made the chamber go quiet. "I fought a Dark Lord," Harry said. "I thought evil would always look like him, like masks and curses and grand speeches. But most evil looks like paperwork and polite voices. It looks like men in offices deciding whose pain doesn't matter." For a moment, dear listener, even the Wizengamot seemed to remember what the war had cost. Flint was convicted, not as easily as it should have been, not without ugly battles, but convicted. Raoul, facing overwhelming evidence and abandoned by those higher up, cut a deal. He gave up names, smaller nodes, hidden hands, people who had believed themselves too minor to be noticed. Elaine Voss, broken by fear and guilt, cooperated fully. She testified, revealed roots, exposed international contacts. Hermione, though furious, did not let herself hate Voss more than she hated the system that had recruited her weakness. The network collapsed in Britain, not fully destroyed. Dark markets never vanish completely, but shattered enough that it would take years for anything similar to rebuild at that scale. And then, once the courtroom dust settled, once the prophet moved on to new scandals, once the ministry corridors returned to their illusion of normal, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were left with the thing no one wrote headlines about, the aftermath inside themselves. The corridor blast haunted their sleep. Hermione flinched when she saw trolleys in certain corridors, her mind remembering too well that ordinary had been weaponized. Ron developed a strange, uneasy habit of mapping rooms automatically. Exits, choke points, distances, like his brain refused to stop playing defense. Harry found himself standing at the window of Grimmauld Place again, watching rain streak down glass, and feeling ancient at 20. One evening, weeks after the convictions, Roberts called them into her office. No ceremony, no fanfare. She looked at them for a long time, then said quietly, "You did good work." Hermione swallowed. "It doesn't feel like it." Robards' eyes softened by a fraction. "It rarely does." Ron's voice was rough. "So what now? We just go back to normal cases?" Robards leaned back slightly. "Yes, because darkness doesn't retire. It just changes shape." Harry felt that familiar heaviness, like stones in deep water. Robards watched him as if reading the weight in his posture. "You're thinking about quitting," she said. Harry didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. "I'm thinking about what this costs," he admitted. Robards nodded once. "Good. If you stop thinking about the cost, that's when it eats you alive." Hermione's voice went very quiet. "How do you keep going?" Toward the ordinary ministry corridor beyond her office, where people walked with parchment and purpose. unaware of how close the building had come to becoming a grave. You learn, she said slowly, that you cannot purify the world. You can only protect it. You hold the line. You keep it from sliding backward. You take victories where you can, and you build systems that make it harder for rot to grow. Ron let out a short, bitter laugh. So we become what? Ward stones? Just standing there forever. Robards's mouth twitched. Something like that. Then her voice softened slightly. But you don't do it alone. You remember that. The job will try to isolate you. It will tell you you're the only one who cares, the only one who sees, the only one who can fix it. That's how it breaks people. Hermione's eyes glistened with something unspoken. Robards's gaze moved between them. You three, she said, are dangerous to corruption because you don't break apart easily. Keep that. Protect that. It matters more than your dueling. Harry felt the words settle into him like a slow, grounding charm. Afterward, the three of them walked out of the ministry together. The atrium was bright with late afternoon light, the enchanted ceiling showing a clean sky. Memos fluttered overhead in orderly lines. Visitors moved through the fireplaces, brushing soot from robes. It looked peaceful. It looked safe. And yet, they all knew what could hide beneath it. Outside, London was damp and grey, but it smelled of rain and stone and life continuing. Hermione stopped on the steps and turned toward them, eyes tired. I don't want to become hard, she said quietly. Ron's expression softened. You're already hard, he said, then added quickly, I mean, she gave him a look, but there was a flicker of fondness in it. Harry understood what she meant. Not hard like strong, hard like flint, convinced that order mattered more than people. I don't think we will, Harry said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice. Because we're not doing this for power, and we're not doing it alone. Ron nodded slowly. And because Hermione will hit us with a book if we start turning into monsters. Hermione huffed a faint laugh, and it sounded like relief. They didn't go back to Grimold Place that night. They went to the Burrow. Because some places, dear listener, are built to remind you that warmth exists even after darkness. Mrs. Weasley scolded them for not eating properly. Mr. Weasley asked too many questions about coded portkeys, with the innocent fascination of a man who could still be delighted by complexity. Ginny arrived late from training, took one look at Harry's face, and pulled him into her arms without asking for details. And in the kitchen, with soup steaming and the sound of family moving around them, Harry felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness, not peace, but something quieter and more durable. Belonging. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Their work continued, as work always does. They investigated smaller trafficking nodes. They rebuilt trust procedures. Hermione helped draft reforms that required cross-department oversight for high-risk authorizations. Ron began teaching a tactical module, unofficial at first, then formal, on pattern detection in organized magical crime. Harry, under Robards' steady mentorship, learned something he'd never been taught at Hogwarts. How to lead without becoming a symbol that swallowed the person underneath. There were still nightmares. There were still days when the ministry corridors felt too narrow. There were still moments when Harry caught sight of a trolley in the distance, and his heart clenched. But they learned to speak about it, to name it, to refuse to pretend they were fine. And that refusal, dear listener, that insistence on staying human, on letting themselves be shaken and still choosing to keep going, became its own kind of victory. Years later, people would tell the story in simple terms. They would say Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger joined the Auror office and helped dismantle a corruption network in the ministry. They would make it sound like a neat arc, beginning, middle, end. But the truth, as Harry understood it now, was quieter and more complicated. The real story wasn't the arrests. It wasn't Flint falling. It wasn't Rowell being bound. It wasn't even the convictions. The real story was what happened afterward. Whether three people who had survived war could survive peace without letting it hollow them out. Whether they could hold the line without becoming the kind of people who believed ends justified any means. Whether they could keep choosing to care. And they did. Not perfectly. Not without struggle. But they did. Because courage, dear listener, is not only standing in front of darkness with a wand raised. Sometimes it is standing in a bright ministry corridor, surrounded by ordinary life, and refusing to let ordinary cruelty become normal again. Sometimes it is going home, eating soup, laughing at something stupid, holding someone's hand, and remembering that the point of protection is not glory. It is life. And so the tale settles, not into a grand ending, but into a living legacy. Harry, Ron, and Hermione became what they had promised themselves they would become on that rainy summer night at Grimmauld Place. Not just survivors, not just symbols, protectors. People who learned that peace is not a gift you receive and keep forever. Peace is work. Daily, exhausting, imperfect work. And still worth it. Rest now, dear listener. Let the ministry's marble and Nocturne's shadows fade. Let the image of three friends walking out into damp London air, tired, bruised, still choosing each other, settle gently in your mind. There will always be webs. There will always be those who want to own the world. But there will also always be people who stand up and say no, not because they believe they can win forever, but because they believe the line matters. Sleep softly, dear listener. And when morning comes, may you wake with the quiet knowledge that even in imperfect worlds, the choice to care is still the strongest magic we have.